Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. So this story takes place 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but it's the single most mind-boggling thing I've ever experienced. It's also important to note that it happened in mid-December. I live in Iowa, and the winter's here. It's extremely cold at night. Like if you get stuck outside, you will die kind of cold. Plus, the snowfall makes everything dead silent. You can hear anything and everything inside the house, and even immediately outside of it. Me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night playing some video games. We were also the only ones at home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went straight from work to the bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine and just live a little. As we were sitting there opening up the first bottle, I hear the door to the garage door open and then slam shut. I immediately go, oh shit, and start looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then says, I thought you said your mom was supposed to be out all night. She was, I replied. Then I heard a few heavy stomps and hear my mother yell out, anyone home? I yell back upstairs, yo, we're just hanging out in the basement, Mom. I hear a few more steps move from the garage door toward the stairs, and then she yells out again, hey, can you come help me with something? I need you up here. I reply back while frantically trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle. Yeah, just give me a minute, Mom. Then there was silence for another 20 seconds. Anyone down there with you? She yelled back in a more concerned and serious tone, and a voice that was slightly off of my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something just wasn't quite right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all my family and friends. Plus the voice, it was just wrong. It sounded like my mother's, but it was missing something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Weirded out, I replied back, it's just called in. After I yelled that back to her, I finally found a good place to hide the bottle and began walking up the steps to the next level. Now as I was walking up those steps, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence of the house and the slight electric twinge that something was not right. When I got to the top of the steps, it's black, pitch black. All the lights were off. There's no moon shining even through any of the windows. Mom, where are you? There was no reply, silence and darkness. I feel the electric twinge turn into full-on needles, and my adrenaline kicks in full force. I have to get out of here as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I run back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. What's wrong, dude? Holden says my mom's not home. I reply as fast as I can, looking for my truck keys. What do you mean? You were just talking with her. I could see the confusion on his face. Dude, there's no one home. We need to leave now. I took a few steps towards the back door that opened up into the yard. Then I see my dog shaking on the couch and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't just leave them. I knew that if we left, something might happen. Are we leaving? Holden said, still confused as hell. No, I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off though. I'm gonna call my mom and figure this out. I pull out my phone and call my mother. She picks up immediately. Hey sweetie, what's going on? She answers. Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling for me from the second level. When I went up there, you weren't here. I said, hoping that she was playing some kind of joke. No, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay? What do you mean you heard me? I feel around on the whole story, and she rushes home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she got back. But before she did, you could hear something upstairs, not walking or sitting on things, but like a pressure in the air, like a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would instinctively describe it as is hungry. When she got home, you could feel the thing leave just as quick as it came, like an overbearing predator presence that just flown away. We've still never figured out what the hell was going on. And this is just one of the many unexplainable things that's happened to us. But this is the easiest to write down, and the one I was happy to have a witness to. Unfortunately, my mother has passed away now, and I've moved away to Arizona. But whenever I go back to Iowa and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened. I will truly never know what exactly happened, but I know that whatever that was at my mother's voice, it was evil and hungry. There's a special kind of magic in the silence after a snowstorm. As a kid, I felt like time itself froze, like the snow wasn't a weather event, but a gift from the universe, a reprieve from the grinding monotony of school and the endless rules of just being young. Snow days were rare enough to feel sacred. And when one would come, it turned everything electric. I remember the morning's best snow casting a soft, Pearland the first delicious moment when the news would come, school was cancelled. The air now felt cleaner on those days, the cold sharper in a way that woke you up more than any alarm clock ever could. I pull on my boots and my puffy coat, scarf wound tight enough to stifle my breath, and head out into the neighborhood before the rest of the world even had begun to stir. It was tradition, the first thing I did before snowball fights with friends, before sledding down a big hill at the park, before I even touched the cocoa my mom left me warming up on the stove. I'd shovel driveways, not just my family's, mind you, ours could wait. No, I'd hit the neighbors' places first, moving faster before anybody else got that same idea, or worse, decided to clear the snow themselves. There was this narrow window under a storm, maybe an hour or two, when fresh snow still sat pristine and untouched. I'd learned to capitalize upon it. I'd knock on those same doors every year, a route ingrained in me as the back roads that I rode my bike on during the summer. Old Mrs. Hendricks across the street was always my first stop. She didn't trust snowblowers, so they messed up the natural lay of her yard. Next would be the Thompsons 3 houses down, who'd lived there since I was born and tipped better than anybody else in the block. Then the Petroviches, who always had their driveway packed down into ice by the time I got there, because their kids were lazy and didn't want to shovel. And so on, house after house, until my arms burned and my fingers went numb, even when I had my gloves on. I make it sound endless, but it was honestly maybe 2 hours worth of work, at least for a breakneck kid like me. Why light to the blinds? I mean, it wasn't all about the money, not really. Sure, I liked having a little cash to spend on some comic books or candy bars, but to me it was more than that. There was this rhythm to shoveling, the scrape of metal on concrete, the satisfying way the driveway transformed from a buried wasteland to a clean slate underneath my boots. There was something about the quiet, working in that quiet, that I just loved. The stillness of the world muffled by snow. Even the sounds of cars were muted, as if the storm had pressed pause on reality itself. Most of the time, I was the only one out there, a few dog walkers, maybe, bundled up and shuffling along with red noses and puffs of white breath trailing after them. But otherwise, it felt like I had the entire block to myself, and the solitude never bothered me. If anything, it felt kind of cozy. I'd work for hours, moving from house to house until the snow was stacked in neat mounds along the edges of every driveway. I can still picture all those houses, too. Every door, every window, every crack in the pavement as familiar to me as the lines of my own palms. I knew the ones to skip, the grumpy old men who'd bark at you to get off their property, or cheapskates who'd offer a handful of nickels for an hour's worth of labor. But most of my neighbors were kind, even the ones who didn't hire me. I could count even a few smiles, maybe a cookie or two for Mrs. Hendricks, and sometimes, even if the snow was bad enough, somebody would give me an extra $5 just for braving it out here. The snow had really piled high that winter, a heavy, dense blanket that muffled the world and turned my neighborhood into a frozen postcard. I was 15, and used to the rhythm of those snow days, the gleeful anarchy of no school, the scramble to bundle up, and the steady grind of shoveling driveways to earn some new cash. It was honest work, the kind of thing that left your muscles aching and your wallet heavier by the end of the day. That year, though, there was a new house to add to my circuit. At the end of the block stood the old Marshall place, a squat little rancher that had been empty for some odd years. Nobody really talked about why it sat so long with that for sale sign out front. It was just one of those places, the kind of house you walk past a little quicker without even knowing why. But a few months back, somebody finally moved in, this middle-aged reclusive man and a woman. At least, that's what I heard, though I hadn't really seen much of them myself. They didn't come to the block parties or wave at the neighbors. If it hadn't been for the faint flicker of their television at night, you'd think the place was still abandoned. That morning, after clearing the other houses, I stood at the edge of their driveway. The snow was untouched. I hesitated, my breath hanging in the air like a question. A quick $20, I told myself. Maybe 30 if they tipped well. Money was money, and if they weren't going to shovel it themselves, somebody had to. I knocked on the door, my knuckles echoing against that hollow wood. It took a long time for them to come answer, and I was about to turn around and leave when I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps, followed by the click of a deadbolt. The door creaked open just wide enough for me to see them. A man stood first, tall and pale. The kind washed-out look that made him seem like an old photograph left far too long out in the sun. His wife stepped into view a moment later, her face almost identical to his in its gauntness. They weren't twins, exactly, but there was something unnerving about how alike they were. Same sharp cheekbones, same sunken eyes. "Can I help you?" the man asked. I explained about shoveling, rattling off my usual pitch about how much I charge, and how quick I could get it done. They both stared at me for a beat too long, their expressions unreadable. Then the woman gave me a small nod, almost to herself. "All right," the man said. "Go ahead." The door then shut without another word, and I got to work. The snow was heavy, packed down with every step, and it took a lot longer than I expected to clear it, even half the driveway. About 20 minutes in, I saw the woman emerge from the house, bundled in a long coat and scarf. She walked down to her car, this old boxy sedan, and backed out slowly onto the street before driving on toward town. I watched her go, tires crunching on the snow, and felt this flicker of unease. Something about the way she moved, it was mechanical, robotic, and it sent my nerves jangling, but I quickly shook it off. People are weird sometimes, it's not that big of a deal. I had almost finished when the front door creaked open again. The man stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed for the weather now, in a thick coat and boots, but he didn't make any move to help, just stood there, watched me. "Almost done," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, but didn't reply. After a moment, he came down the steps and started pacing along the edge of the driveway. "You do this every year?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "It's a good way to make some money, and people around here know me, so." I trailed off, realizing how stupid that sounded. He grunted, stopped walking, and turned to face me. He charged 20. 25, I said quickly. I wasn't about to let him blowball me, after all this effort. "I thought it was 20, he said again. "Your drive is much bigger than I thought, plus the snow is extra high over here." He nodded along. "No chance of 20? "Sorry," was all I said. He tilted his head like he was considering it, then just nodded again. "All right, you want to come inside when you're done? Warm up with some hot chocolate?" My gut twisted. The way he said it, it wasn't friendly, it wasn't neighborly. It felt like a trap, like a spider offering tea to a fly. He hovered behind me, impossibly tall. Everything in my psyche was screaming at me to run. "No thanks," keeping my voice as polite as I could. "I've got a few more driveways to do before it dumps again." He didn't push, it just shrugged and said he'd go get the money. He disappeared back into the house, and I tried to get my hands to quit shaking. I shoveled faster now, working double time to finish and just get out of there. Something about that man was just all wrong. The way he watched me like he was sizing me up, like I wasn't a kid with a shovel, but a problem he was trying to solve. I paused to wipe the sweat from my forehead, and that's when I saw him again. He was at the window now, the one in the living room, curtains pulled back just enough to see his face. He was holding a camera now, the one with the long lens, and he was taking pictures of me. My stomach turned to ice. I dropped the shovel and took a step back, boots slipping on the packed snow. I watched the camera's flash pop twice. He didn't even care that I could see him, like he wanted me to know what he was doing. I turned towards the street, ready to leave now, but then I saw the car. The woman was back, her sedan crawling slowly up the road. She stopped at the base of the driveway, engine idling, and just sat there, staring at me through the windshield. She slowly pulled into the driveway, like she was savoring the approach. Tires crunched against the snow. I stood there awkwardly, shovel still in hand, unsure if I should just leave, but something told me to just stay. Maybe it was the way your gaze locked on me, as she continued to park her car, unblinking. She stepped out, the cold air now seeming sharper with her presence, every breath visible like pale ribbons. She nodded at me, lips twitching into the thin, strange smile. "All finished?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, clearing my throat, and tried again. "Yeah, I'm done. I just came to let you know." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes scanned the driveway. She was inspecting my work. She nodded again, satisfied, at least seeming to be, then tilted her head. "Did you go inside?" The question hit me like a slap to the face. "No," I said a little too quickly. "No, I didn't. Why would I go inside?" "That's a shame," she said. "You would have had so much fun." The words turned my stomach. There's definitely something weird here, something going on. I took a step back without realizing it, and my boots slid a little bit on the packed snow. Before I could say anything else, the front door creaked open. The man stepped out, but now holding a neat stack of bills in his gloved hand. He didn't say anything as he walked toward me, each step deliberate, crunching through that snow. "Here," he said, holding out the money. I reached for it, but he didn't let it go right away. Instead, he started counting the bills aloud, one at a time, his voice slow and deliberate. 1, 2, 3. He was paying me in $1 bills. By the time he hit 25, I was ready to bolt, but he didn't release the cash. Instead, he leaned in slightly, eyes boring into mine. Are you sure you don't want to come inside? He asked again, voice colder now. No, I said, almost ready to scream. I've got to go. The change in his demeanor was instant, like a switch flipping. His face then turned into a snarl, and he yelled, then get off my property now. I didn't need to be told twice. I stuffed the money in my pocket and sprinted down the driveway. I did not look back, even when I thought I heard the woman laughing, not even when I felt the weight of their stares pressing on my back. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me and vowed never to set foot near that place again. Never waved, never offered a shovel again. Just avoided that place like a plague. Once, when I was in college, I lost the key to my car, and I didn't have a spare. It was the middle of winter. I didn't have a choice but to walk to a car dealership 6 or 7 miles from my apartment to get a replacement. In hindsight, this seems like such a weird, desperate avenue to take, literally. I think I used the winter time as an excuse not to ask for a ride, but damn, it was also the best excuse for a ride. Walking in the snow sucks, but I was young, and 7 miles didn't sound that far. Let me tell you how wrong I was. This was the most exhausting thing I've ever done. The first mile took my breath away, but after that, each step took noticeably more effort. My energy levels weren't that great to start with, having the stress of no car or key, so I was handicapped from the get-go. The other mistake that I made was not realizing there would be another 7 miles waiting for me on the return trip. This really was desperation, not planning out any part of the journey before me. I got there just fine in the early afternoon, but it took a lot longer than I thought to get a replacement key. The quote they gave me over the phone was way shorter than what they told me in the waiting room. An hour turned into 2, and then I didn't hear back from anybody. The sun set. Snow started to fall. Finally, someone came out with an envelope with my name on it, 2 keys, ready for my car. I just needed to navigate the snowy roadways in the dark. I pulled up my flimsy hood up against the wind and snow, but it was completely useless. The gusts cut right through it, and my whole face was frozen numb within the first 10 minutes. My phone said it dropped from 19 degrees to negative 25 degrees. This accounted for the wind chill, which had frozen my scarf stiff. I could feel my lips blistering from the temperatures. Another factor presented itself. I forgot my inhaler. It was in my school bag. I started being careful all the way back not to breathe too deeply. My breathing was just about the only thing I had control over, so I actually had to slow down my pace even more just to accommodate my lungs. It was like a death trap for a person like me, having to move slower and slower in plummeting temperatures. I started hearing this strange, tiny clicking noise. I realized that the condensation from my breath had settled on my eyelashes, and the wind had frozen them, making them clink every time I blinked. I laughed at first, but after hearing it enough, I started to panic. Would my eyelashes break off by the time I got home? Would the frost extend the liquid in my eyeballs and start to freeze them too, getting colder and colder, and exerting more and more just to keep going? Eventually, the inevitable asthma attack starts, about 3 blocks from my apartment. It starts as this biting fire, and soon, my lungs are empty and shriveled. It's like someone just hit me in the back with a sledgehammer and knocked the wind completely out of me. Now, I'm trying to recover through a straw. It's a panicked feeling, and I can't afford to fall into this attack anymore. Somehow, I managed to stagger the rest of the way through, and kept losing track of whether my feet were moving or not. Sometimes I thought I was just standing in place, but when I looked down, I'd be in motion. It was a very weird hallucination. When I finally made it, I knew all I had to do was to get to my inhaler. I knew exactly where it was. I just had to get to it. I climbed the stairs. I opened the door. I collapsed on the couch from where I left my bag. Numb fingers fumbled it out, but I only managed one of the required 2 puffs before the oxygen deprivation rendered me unconscious. I'd never passed out before. The involuntary nature of the experience was sickening. My roommates thought I was napping and covered me with a blanket, boots and all. I regained consciousness in the wee hours, weak and wheezing. As I regained coherency, I remembered what had happened. I broke down and sobbed quietly as I could. I could feel the chill in the space between my organs. I was scared to pull my boots off and see what my feet looked like. The 1 puff had been enough to open my airway a little bit. I used my inhaler again, and though I probably should have gone to the hospital, I just put on a few layers and had a cup of mint tea, and then went to bed. My body seemed to be fine, aside from the absolute destroyed muscles in my legs and my chest. There was a throb in my head too, but not enough to get me out of the house again. Then I remembered the keys in the envelope, the whole goal of my mission. I trekked through in a panic. I checked the interior pocket. There they were, safe and sound. All was right in winter wonderland. My roommates were flabbergasted when I told them what had happened the next day. They really thought that I was just deeply asleep. I was very lucky to not have died. So obviously next time, I'm asking for a ride. When I was 21 years old, I would be home alone at my parents' house a lot. We lived on a little pond, which was directly in our backyard. On the other side of the pond was a little town park. Our neighbors were a bit spaced out. It was a pretty upscale, expensive block compared to the rest of the town, so the properties were big. I'm fully moved out now, but this was back when I was in college. My parents make a lot of money, and we have multiple homes, so often I was home alone. It was a random night in the summertime. I was off from school, so I can't remember if it was the weekend or weekday, but odds are since I was home, it was a random weekday. I was in the back sunroom watching a show. That was my favorite room in the house in the summer, because it was the most cozy and had the best breeze with all the windows open. I was right on the corner of the couch closest to the corner window when I heard splashing from outside. Like in the pond. It could have been a goose or duck. Sometimes they'd fight in the water and make a bunch of splashing sounds, so at first I ignored it, but as it persisted, I decided to lower the volume on the TV and listen. I put my ear up to the window even, and I heard consistent splashing sounds, way too heavy to be from a duck or goose. It sounded like they were splashes from a person. I opened the door in the sunroom and stepped outside to the deck. I looked out to the pitch darkness of the backyard. I now heard a man's humming along with the splashes. Someone was definitely swimming in the water. They were trespassing. Each house on the pond owned a specific chunk of the pond. I stepped inside for a second to flick on the lights to the backyard deck. As I did this, just a bit of the pond was exposed, and the splashes and humming stopped. Whoever it was clearly saw me. I wondered if it was one of the neighbors going for a swim or something, which also just seemed weird because no one really swam in the pond ever. But honestly, whether it was or wasn't a neighbor, I wasn't going to confront whoever it was. I stepped back inside and turned off the lights, of course locking the door as well. I texted my brother, who was away at college, about it. He didn't answer right away. I was trying not to creep myself out over it, but watching TV after this was kind of hard. I couldn't focus on the show. I looked out the window, but all I could see outside was darkness. I still had the TV on in the background, not realizing how revealing the light from the TV would be outside. And then I thought I heard something on the deck. I hurried to find the remote and turn off the TV, and as the room went black and silent, it took me a few seconds to adjust and realize that there was the sound of someone's heavy breathing right outside one of the many windows in the room. I instantly laid down flat on the couch to try and hide myself, and after a short moment of silence, a deep voice from outside the window said, "I see you." My heart dropped into my stomach. I couldn't decide in the moment whether to speak or keep hiding, so I just blurted out, "Paul, is that you?" Paul was the name of one of our neighbors. I said this clinging on to the hope that maybe it was him, and he was just messing with me, but the man outside didn't respond to this. I just heard footsteps walking away. As the barefoot-sounding footsteps faded to silence, I still laid flat on the couch, too afraid to move. I laid for a few minutes, before the thought to go check that all the doors were locked came to mind. I exploded off the couch and ran straight for the front door. It was locked, as was the side entrance door. After a little while longer, and texting my entire family about what was going on, my dad told me to turn the backyard lights on, and check if anyone was still out there. He basically told me to be the man of the house and protect it, so I listened and checked the back deck through the window. It was clear. I brought a big knife outside with me onto the deck, and I looked down. There were wet footprints that had half dried by then, but I could tell that they were barefoot footprints. I followed the trail of footprints around to the side part of the deck, and what I saw was nightmare fuel. The top part of someone's head, namely their eyes and forehead, was peering just over the edge of the deck from the ground below, looking at me as if he heard me coming and was waiting. As we made eye contact, he turned away, and by now I was ready to call 911. I did so before even telling my parents. I locked myself inside, waiting for them, and when they came, I felt instantly better. They asked if our family had any enemies or people who don't like us, or if we have any problem neighbors. Questions like this. They did do a quick sweep of the property, and then left. I decided to shut every window that night, and run the air conditioning just for added safety. When I awoke the next morning, I was just delighted to see sunlight. I don't believe that man ever returned to our house, and we still don't know who it could have been. I have a dog who I take for a walk 3 times a day. First in the morning, then in the afternoon, and finally at night. I take him on the same route every time, which is through our driveway exit, which leads to a cul-de-sac parking lot for the condominium complex we live in. This will make sense soon as to why I'm telling you this. On the night walk, I always go somewhat late. I'm not sure why, but it's been a habit ever since I've had him, and it's never been a problem for us. Until one night, I begin our final walk of the day and go our usual route. I have a flashlight with me as there are no lights at the parking lot, and I'm listening to music with only one AirPod as I feel it would be for the best just in case I heard something unusual. And I did. As I'm approaching the parking lot, I was hearing something, a voice of some kind that was up ahead of me, but I was completely zoned out in my own world of music as it was happening. But then my mind finally caught up and I stopped. I took the AirPod out and stood still to listen, just to see if I was only hearing things, and then it happened again, a voice that spoke ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone. So I did the stupid thing and continued to carefully walk forward because I thought it was all in my head, but something didn't feel right about it. I stopped again after a few feet, right next to where all of the cars were parked, and I had my flashlight pointed everywhere in front of me. I stayed listening, and the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, yet was hearing a muffled voice of what sounded like a kid say the word help. My heart dropped so fast I couldn't move my legs. I frantically pointed my flashlight everywhere to see where it was coming from. I was sure it was coming from the cars, but I was completely thrown off by this. But there wasn't a kid in sight, or anyone nearby. It was just me and my dog, who didn't seem to notice anything as he was just sniffing some bushes nearby. And then I heard it again. The word help was spoken 3 more times, and it was coming from my left side where the cars were parked. It made me panic even more. I didn't know what to think of it, and I knew I wasn't imagining this when I saw my dog's ears perked up, and he was looking in the same direction I was facing after it happened. And that's when it hit me about how incredibly eerie all of this was. After hearing it multiple times, I realized the kid's voice didn't sound entirely like a kid. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the mix of an adult and a child at the same time. And each time they called for help, not only was the voice always muffled, but it was spoken in a more generic statement as opposed to a cry for actual help every time. And I mean that literally. There was absolutely no change in the tone, inflection, sound, or anything of sorts. My dog and I ran straight home afterwards, and I tried to explain to my mom what happened. She was puzzled herself about what it could have been, and I suggested we call the cops on the off chance that there was actually someone in need of help, but she didn't think it was necessary. So many questions were conjuring up in my head. Why was the voice muffled? Was there someone in the car that I couldn't see? Or was it something darker waiting for me to move closer? I don't like to think too much about it, but whatever it was, it still makes me feel extremely disturbed to this day. This picture is where I had stopped and taken my AirPods out to listen, and I heard it up ahead on the left. This is where I had gotten closer and heard it on my left side. I'm aware that there is a condo complex on the right side, which some may think the noise was coming from, but it was in this direction facing the cars where my dog and I heard it, and you could see from this point of view that there's nothing to really indicate a noise coming from somewhere else. Also, at the time this happened, the cars that were parked were trucks and SUV types, so they were a lot larger and covering more space, thus making it harder to see from where I was standing. I never figured this out. What I'm about to tell you is the reason why my parents moved out of a house that was in the family for 3 generations. I've struggled with depression most of my life. It's hard for me to shake the feeling of being useless. I'm doing much better now, but when I was a kid, it was horrible. Because of that, I spent a lot of time alone in my room. My house was nestled in a very woodsy area. There were trees on 3 sides of it, and a forest separating it from any neighbors. My room was pretty big for a bedroom. It was in the back corner of the house, so the windows on 2 walls faced the woods. It was honestly pretty scary for a kid my age. It didn't help that I was also scared of the dark. Things started happening when I was around 10 or so. I was in the 5th grade, and I was at the age where it wasn't acceptable to sleep in my parents' bed after a nightmare, but I was still accused of having an active imagination. The first thing I noticed was my nightlight. It had different color settings, so if I wanted, I could change the LED around. I liked keeping it on red, which is what I fell asleep to most nights. One night though, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, which was unusual for me. I was really tired and fell back asleep in under a minute. But before I did, I noticed that my night light was a different color than the red I always left on. I didn't think much of it until about a week later. One morning, I woke up and realized my night light was once again not set to red like it always was. I asked my parents why they were messing with my night light, but they were confused and told me they didn't know what I was talking about. I explained what had happened to them, and they told me that the thing had always been glitchy. They knew best, so I accepted that answer for a while, at least until one morning after waking up to see my night light unplugged completely. It was just sitting there on the floor. Once again, my parents dismissed my concern and told me my brain should be focused on school. My dad said I was getting too old for a nightlight anyway. A few days later, my night light was missing completely. It had seemingly evaporated out of existence. Now I knew my parents were lying to me. They probably thought I should have outgrown the night light by then and took matters into their own hands. This incident caused a massive fight between them, and I, since both of us accused the other of hiding it, and neither of us was budging. I couldn't believe my parents would blatantly lie to me about something like this, but there was nothing I could do. After that, things went back to normal for a week. That didn't last long though. 3 nights in a row, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. Each time, I had no idea what was waking me up. After it happened a 4th time in a row, I told my parents. They told me that I was going through puberty, and that changes to my body are natural. The next time it happened, I stayed awake instead of falling back asleep. A few minutes after I woke up, I heard faint rustling noises from my closet. My parents didn't believe me. My dad even checked my closet, and there was nothing in there besides old toys and posters. The next 4 days remained the most traumatizing nights I have ever experienced in my life. I had been woken up only to hear rustling in my closet. It was torture. I couldn't take it anymore. I begged my parents to believe me, and my dad got angry. He dragged me to my closet to prove there was nothing in there. He started throwing toys around my room, clearing the closet bit by bit, yelling at me the whole time. That is, until he pulled one of the posters off the wall. My mother and father stared in horror at the massive hole in the wall the posters had concealed. My mom started screaming, and my dad pulled out a flashlight. The hole was way too deep to see where it led, so my dad ran outside and began inspecting the outside of the house. There was a tiny hole in the dirt at the base of the house, and a little digging revealed that it was more than a divot. There was literally a passageway from the woods to my room. My mom and I were out of the house that night to my aunt's house. We moved out shortly after this. I stayed at my aunt's house until we did. I don't like thinking about this experience, but I'm going to have to face it eventually. My parents also refused to talk about this incident, and I think it's partly because they feel some blame for not taking me seriously. It's chilling to think that there was a stranger in my room every night for over a month. I have no idea what they wanted, and will probably never know. If your kids come to you with something that sounds abnormal, believe them. My name is Leo. To be completely honest with you, I'm a little lost in life right now. I won't get into it too much, but all you need to know is that my family's situation is horrible. For the past 3 years, I've tried to stay as far away from home as possible. My close friends from high school have been changing in ways I don't like, and I feel like my hometown has nothing to offer me anymore. I'm about to be a senior in college, and to be completely honest, I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to do with my life after that. Enough with the sob story though. I was in Berlin last year for whatever reason, probably searching for a sense of place or trying to find a direction in life. I remember the name of the bar I was in, Reduia. I was there alone, nothing I'm not used to. I was getting ready to leave when I felt around my pocket and realized my apartment keys were missing. Just my luck. I stumbled out of the bar and began walking toward my apartment anyway. The whole thing was locked up, there was no way I was getting in there, and it was way too late at night to get a replacement set. I'm not sure what most people would do in a situation like this, but my first thought was to start looking for a place to sleep. As if my luck wasn't bad enough, it started raining. Eventually I decided to sleep under a nearby bridge. I didn't even know where I was, but I was out of the rain and safe, so I was happy. As I was drifting off, I began picking up on some faint voices coming from across the river. I sat back up and saw what looked like 5 men standing on the opposite side of the river, along with a little boat that was tied off. They didn't seem to notice me. It took me less than a minute to realize what I was watching. There was an honest-to-God drug dealer, or something going down right in front of me. My German isn't great, so I wasn't really able to make out what they were saying, but several briefcases and duffel bags were exchanging hands. so I filled in the blanks myself. I thought about finding a new spot, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself by moving. I figured I'd just wait for this to be over, then leave. All of a sudden, one of the men yelled something aggressively in German and pointed a gun at one of the other men. There was a brief moment of silence before the other guy put his hands up and began talking really quickly. It looked like he was being set up. The other men stripped the man at gunpoint of his clothing and started confiscating his belongings. I didn't feel safe there anymore and got up slowly to move. As I did, I heard one of the men shout what roughly translates to, "There's someone there." I started running, not even turning to look at them. They shouted more things at me, but the only words I was able to understand were, "Don't shoot." I ran until I threw up and nearly passed out due to drunken exhaustion. There was no way they'd be able to catch me, but they could have easily killed me. Sometimes I still think about how I could have lost my life that night if those men had decided to fire at me. Sometimes I feel like I'm fated to run forever. It was a normal Friday afternoon at my high school. I was walking down a hallway with my friend Emma as she talked about God knows what. I was just trying to get through the day because I honestly had a lot to deal with at home, as well as at school, being that my foster parents weren't the nicest people, to say the least. As we walked past the lunchroom, I suddenly had to use the bathroom. I asked Emma if she had to go. She said no, and that she would wait outside for me. I went into the bathroom and immediately noticed no one else was in there. I thought to myself, that was weird because out of the multiple bathrooms in the school, this one was always packed at any given time. I shrugged it off and went into a stall, and a few seconds after getting in the stall and sitting down, I heard the bathroom entrance door open and shut abruptly and someone entering the bathroom, but I didn't hear them move after entering. I didn't think anything of this. It wasn't really anything out of the ordinary. Maybe it was someone hiding from an admin. I went about my business. I stood up to button my jeans and read the writing on the bathroom wall. It was a bunch of random quotes and rants about teachers. Then I heard the door open again, and I assumed whoever was in here had left. I came out of the stall, and as I left the bathroom, Emma was looking at me with a weird face, almost like a "what the hell did I just see" face. I asked her what was up, and she asked me, "Who is that standing right behind you in the bathroom stall?" I got chills. I told her no one was in the stall with me, and to stop fucking with me. She promised me she wasn't. She told me she actually came in seconds before I came out, because she realized she did need to go. But then she saw someone else in the stall, standing with their shoes touching the back of mine. That's how close they were behind me in the stall. And she said she left immediately, not wanting to witness whatever was going on. I reiterated again, I was the only one in the stall. However, I had heard someone come in, but I never heard them use the bathroom, and I had assumed they were hiding from an admin. That's when she told me no one went near the door until she came in seconds before I came out. I didn't believe in the paranormal, but this made my stomach sink. I found an admin and told her about it, and she pretty much tried to assure me that it didn't happen, that Emma was probably just messing with me. But Emma was never one to take things seriously or be serious in general. So when she looked me in the eyes with a serious face and told me word for word what she saw, I felt like it actually happened, and something really was in there with me, along with the fact that I heard the bathroom door open and close twice. I'm 18 now, and I haven't forgotten it since. This happened long ago when I was renting a small house in the town that I got my first real big girl job at. It was a small one-floor house with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and just enough living space for myself and occasionally hosting some people. I had been living there for a few weeks already. All was fine. The landlord, who I'll just call Michelle, was really friendly and understanding. I think she rented to me because she didn't want a male renting out her house. I'll skip unnecessary details and get right to the point. Something very weird started happening a few weeks into living there. One regular work night, I got a knock at the door. I went to the other side and said, "Who is it?" And no one responded. I didn't open it. No one should be knocking on my door late at night. It was early the next morning. I had finished getting ready for work and was about to leave. I opened my front door and saw a big post-it note taped to the storm door. It said, "Hello, beautiful." I right away remembered the knocks on the door from last night. It was no doubt the same person, but the big question was, who could it be? I crumpled it out of disgust and threw it in the trash, hoping and assuming it would be a one-and-done thing. It was that night that I got another knock at the door, this time a little earlier while I was cooking dinner. I went over to the door, this time not saying anything, just listening. There was no peephole or glass to look through to the other side. I had no way of seeing who was there without opening the door, and that wasn't going to happen as the storm door didn't lock. But this was the second night in a row, and now I was realizing this was some kind of stalker situation. I called my mom and dad to ask for advice, and really they didn't even know what to say. My dad, who is a retired police officer, said that if I called the cops, they wouldn't really be of any help unless they were catching the person in the act. My dad advised me to not go outside late at night for a while, don't answer the door, and if it persists, that he'd come to town and spend a few days with me. So that was the advice I followed. The next morning, the first thing I did was check the storm door for another note, and part of me died inside when I saw another note stuck to the glass. This one said, "I like to watch you." I took a picture of it with my phone and sent it to not only my family, but Michelle as well. I asked Michelle if she had any kinds of issues with certain men or any stalkers. She acted appalled and shocked when I sent her a picture of the note and told her about the knocks. She assured me that she didn't have any stalkers and that she was in a long-term relationship. Still, I wasn't entirely convinced. I left a note on the door after work that day, saying if you're looking for Michelle, she does not live here, she only rents this house out. If you continue to come here, I will be reporting this to the police. Doing this gave me a level of comfort, actually. I thought this would end things. That night, every waking minute was spent with anxiety, worrying about hearing knocks at the door again. To my relief, there were none tonight. I went to sleep in relative peace, thinking my note worked. The next morning, I opened the door and removed my note from the glass, but then realized it wasn't my note. It was a new note, and it said, "I'm not looking for Michelle, I'm looking for you." And then it said my name, followed with, "I like watching you," like it said in the previous note. I sent it to my dad right away. I felt seriously ill. My dad packed a bag and drove up first thing. He was at my house by the time I got home from work, and work that day was rough because I couldn't think of anything except for this horrific situation. I even wondered if someone in my office could have been doing this, like this creepy guy Fernando. My dad and I waited to call the police together, until later in the night when we figured whoever was doing this may be hiding out there already. We wanted them to see the police presence. We spoke with an officer outside. My dad said it must have been a busy night, since they only sent one. My dad, being a retired police officer, obviously didn't hurt in this whole situation. After the officer left with his report, my dad stayed out on the front stoop for hours, even after I went to sleep. Obviously the person didn't return that night, and I moved out once I was able to pack all my things. Michelle was completely understanding. Thankfully whoever was stalking me at that house didn't follow me to my new place, likely eliminating the possibility that it was a coworker. So I will likely never know who it was. I'll be honest with you, I've probably spent more time chasing women than I'd like to admit. I've had to tone it down a lot since college, partly because of what I'm about to tell you. I went to school in California, and while I haven't been back in a while, when I was there, the culture was very open. And when I say open, I mean sexual. This honestly could have been true for other colleges in other states at the time, but I really wouldn't know. It was my sophomore year, and I had just finished pledging the fraternity pike. About halfway through the semester, though, I was getting sick of only talking to sorority girls that seemed to know half the guys in every frat. It was honestly a little gross, and I started developing a fear that every girl I was interested in had been with several people I personally knew. I tried my luck and created a Tinder profile. It wasn't long before I matched with someone whose interests seemed to match mine. We started talking, and things were going well. After a few days, we made plans to meet up at a local college bar called Tap House on a Saturday night. This was actually my favorite bar in the area because it had pool tables, and I had been clearing racks since I was 10 years old. I remember getting there a little early, so I could secure a table and warm my muscles up a bit. An hour passed, though, and I came to terms with the fact that I had probably been stood up. I was trying to decide whether I should salvage the night or just go home and play online chess when I got a notification. To my surprise, it was Yamil, the girl I was waiting on, telling me she had just arrived. I greeted her, and she apologized for being late. We got some drinks, played some pool, and got to know each other. She was Latina and a heavy drinker, so I got plastered just trying to keep up. At one point, she asked for my Instagram, which I gave to her. 10 seconds later, I found myself staring at a collection of explicit photos she had just sent me. I was confused, but in my drunken state, I wasn't going to complain. Before I could even respond, she told me, "Your turn," which I figured could only mean one thing. Honestly, if I hadn't been so drunk, I probably would have questioned why we were sending pictures to each other when we were literally 5 feet apart. But I didn't have the foresight. I complied with her request. We laughed about the whole thing, and that was that. A few hours later, things at the bar were starting to wind down. I was planning on inviting her to my place, but she beat me to it, asking if I could spend the night at hers. I agreed, and we left the bar. I couldn't even walk in a straight line. It was honestly embarrassing. We Ubered to her apartment, which was actually in Oakland, something I hadn't realized before. Honestly, red flags should have been going off in my brain the moment we crossed into Oakland. She unlocked the door of her apartment and stepped aside so I could go first. I took a few steps inside and heard the door shut behind me. It was pitch black in there. As I was turning around to ask her to flip some lights on, the room lit up. To my horror, I wasn't facing a harmless 5 feet 2 inches girl anymore. Instead, 2 massive bald dudes with tank tops were standing in front of the door with their hands clasped. I turned around, and there was another white bald dude in front of me. I wish I could tell you more about the room I was in, but it was honestly difficult for me to recall small details of that night. I couldn't fight or flee, so I just froze. The guy in front of me began telling me my own name, birthday, and age. He then went on to say that the girl I had just gone out with was 17, meaning I had received and sent explicit pictures to a minor. He then suggested that I do what I was told, which I did. The 2 guys behind me confiscated my phone, wallet, and keys, all of which I gave up without a fight. I asked the guy in front of me what he wanted, and he basically told me that he was a major distributor of illicit substances in Northern California. He told me that I'd be outed as a pedophile if I didn't distribute his product to my fraternity and university. I wish I could remember more specifics. The 2 men behind me then gave me a piece of paper and told me to write down my address followed by a list of names and numbers for as many students as I knew. I told them that I'd need my phone to complete the list, so one of them held it firmly in front of me and let me scroll through. All 3 of them were hovering over me now, knowing I was basically checkmated. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but the literal second I saw a chance, I ran. I was too drunk to think about the consequences of those pictures on my phone. I narrowly escaped out the door I had entered from and ran as fast as I possibly could. It's not like I was safe though. I was still smack dab in one of the most dangerous places in America. Eventually, I found a nice looking house and begged them to open up. I pleaded with them to let me use their phone and call 911, and then I told the police everything. But of course, I didn't remember the address of that girl's apartment. An officer picked me up and took down a report before asking me if I would be okay leading them back to that apartment. I was actually able to retrace the way I had run, and I waited in one of the squad cars as the police barged in. After a few minutes, an officer told me that the place was completely deserted and there were not any signs that people had even been there. In the following weeks, the police actually took my report seriously and launched a full-scale investigation. They concluded that it was probably gang-related, but were never able to arrest anyone. That was years ago. I bet this incident has been swept under the rug of Oakland's rampant crime and drug-related activity. In all honesty, what happened to me all those years ago is probably nowhere near the top of the list when it comes to that godforsaken place. I haven't used a dating app since. I've been smoking cigarettes every day for years. Before you judge me, let me just say that I recently started seeing a therapist for my nicotine addiction. Unfortunately, it hasn't helped much. The only thing worse than my nicotine addiction is my sleep schedule. I don't know what it is. I find myself staying up hours past midnight and rarely get out of bed before noon. While I'm trying to fix these parts of my life, they're extremely relevant to what I'm about to tell you. It began a few months ago. I was standing on my balcony like I do most nights, smoking a cigarette. I live in a really secluded neighborhood. It's not like the houses around here are right next to each other. Despite this, I have a neighbor whose fence I can see over if I'm standing on my balcony. I'm not nosy or anything, but this particular night, I was looking into his yard. I had never met the guy, but I assumed he lived alone since there was only ever a navy blue BMW parked in his driveway. But not this night though. There was a black van I had never seen before sitting in front of his house. I didn't make anything of it, just noting the coincidence to myself. The next night though, I made it a point to pay attention to his yard, and the same black van was parked there again. I didn't assume something sinister was going on. I was more intrigued than anything. The following morning, I went up to my balcony and looked into his yard. The van was gone. For the remainder of the week, I made a game out of observing the van at night, theorizing its purpose. I said I wasn't nosy, but I'm sure I'm obsessive. It's actually the main reason most of my friends drifted out of my life. I wasn't going to do more than observe, though. It wasn't my business or place to poke around further. That is, until one night, when I saw something that completely changed my perspective of the situation. I was up later than usual. It was maybe 5 in the morning. The van was there, as it had been the past several nights. I was smoking my last cigarette when my neighbor actually walked outside, something I hadn't seen yet. I watched as he made his way to the van, carrying what appeared to be a long black bag. It almost looked like a set of golf clubs, only much heavier. After opening the van's sliding door, he delicately placed the bag inside. He promptly got in the driver's seat and sped off. I was dumbfounded. I had absolutely no idea what he could have been carrying. I was exhausted though, so I figured I'd think about it more the next morning. The next day, I decided that I'd go out on my balcony a little earlier and wait for the van to arrive at his house. I brought my laptop up there so I could get some work done and wait. It was around 10 p.m. and the van wasn't in the driveway, but around 1 a.m. the van pulled in. I quickly shut my laptop and watched. Nothing happened for a good several minutes, like the van just sat there, engine running and all. After about 5 minutes, the driver door opened, and there he was. I watched as he went around to the side of the van, then slid the door open and pulled out the same bag that he had put in the night before. He seemed to be struggling this time around, visibly trying not to crack under the weight of whatever was in there. After waddling a few slow steps, both he and the bag disappeared into his house. I didn't know what to think. I thought about waiting there until 5 a.m. again, but that would be far too taxing on my brain. Something was definitely wrong, though, and I was determined to find out what. The next morning, I flipped a coin and ultimately decided to follow his van when he pulled out that night. After a pretty unproductive day, I went up to my balcony around 4 a.m. and waited, cigarette in hand. As soon as I saw movement in his driveway, I rushed downstairs, grabbed my keys, and got my car. I turned my headlights off and waited for the van to turn onto the main road. Once it did, I began tailing it. After 20 minutes of driving, he pulled onto a dirt path that looked like it led into the woods. It did. I followed, and the woods actually started thinning up a bit. It seemed like this path had once been a main road or something. We drove for another few minutes before I realized what his destination was. There was a deserted gas station literally tucked away in some clearing in the woods, and right in front of it was the BMW I had always seen parked in his driveway. I feared I was getting too close, so I turned my car around and parked across the street from the dirt road. I must have waited there an hour. His BMW finally pulled out of the clearing. Nervously, I started driving back up the path, not sure what I'd find. I pulled over on the side of the road and started walking towards the gas station. It was eerie. The front door was locked. I walked around to the side. That was locked as well. So was the back door. I needed to know what was inside. There was a row of windows that I tried to open, but none of them would budge. Against my better judgment, I picked up a rock and slammed it into one of the windows. It shattered pretty easily, but there must have been a security system in that place because alarm bells started blaring. I sprinted back to my car, the whole time wondering why an abandoned gas station would be rigged with an alarm system. As I sped out of there, I called 911 and gave them a vague description before hanging up. I got back to my house and ran inside, my heart still racing. The next morning, I woke up hoping the whole thing had blown over. Boy, was I wrong. I went up to my balcony to see like 8 police cars in my neighbor's driveway, lights flashing and everything. I watched as an officer escorted my neighbor out of his house in handcuffs. One by one, the police cars drove away, and I was left to my imagination. I lit a cigarette and stood there, finally alone with my thoughts. I've asked the police for details on several occasions, but they would never answer my questions. I've even tried driving back up to that gas station, but the whole road had been blocked off. Maybe one day I'll work up the courage to walk through the woods and go looking for answers. I'm not somebody who grew up with any kind of sleep disorders, such as sleep paralysis or night terrors. I've always been a very heavy sleeper, so that's why when what I'm about to tell you started happening, it was a shock to me. We all have the occasional nightmare. I used to call nightmares a free, 3D immersive horror movie. To most, that will probably sound freakish, but in a weird way, I sometimes like the thrill of waking up after a nightmare. I was living with my one roommate, Patricia. I just called her Trish. We had very different schedules with work, so we didn't see each other much besides on the weekends. This happened in July. I remember because it was so hot out that I had the window AC unit on full blast every night, which also provided a white noise that helped me sleep better. It was the first night that I had the nightmare, a few days after my ex and I had broken up and life wasn't exactly the best. I had a dream that I vaguely remember for the most part, but the part that I vividly remember is being in a room full of my family members sitting quietly around a dinner table, and standing across the table from me was what I could best describe to be a creature that looked like one of the aliens from the movie Science, only with horns and claws. It looked like what you'd imagine a sleep paralysis demon to look like, only I was still fully asleep and dreaming. The next thing I knew, the thing was standing next to me, looking down at me. I started to run away in my dream until I was in my room, or I guess my brain's version of my room. That was the last of that dream I remember before waking up. My room was pitch black, and the AC fan was on full blast. My heart was racing a bit from the dream, and I sat there thinking, wow, that was a creepy dream. I looked around the room naturally, before laying back down and going to sleep. The following night, I woke up in the middle of the night to my bedroom door open, which I usually 99% of the time would leave shut unless I was drinking. My immediate thought was that it was Trish checking if I was home. I went up to go shut it, and went back to sleep fairly quickly. I asked Trish if she came in my room the next day via text, and she told me she did not. So it was always possible I just took a midnight trip to the bathroom or kitchen that I didn't remember. It was the following night that I had another nightmare. That same demon creature from my previous dream appeared again in this one. This one was a lot more disturbing. Instead of being with my family, I was in a dark, square, empty room with the thing, and it kept getting closer to me. Oddly, I don't remember the thing actually moving its limbs to walk. I just remember that it kept getting closer and closer until it was on top of me. And then, like I couldn't even move, the thing took a claw to my thigh and scratched me. And I actually think I felt the pain in my dream. Then, the next thing I remember is waking up. I don't mean I woke up right after that. I mean I don't remember what happened after that in the dream. But it was dark in the room once again, AC on full blast. I felt a slight stinging feeling on my upper thigh. I felt it with my hand, and I actually felt like I felt something on the skin. I rushed to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and I screamed out loud when I saw a gash in my thigh. I went to Trisha's room and turned on the light, waking her up. She asked how the fuck I got that, and I screamed I don't know. We went to my room together and flipped off all the sheets and covers off the bed, looking for any kinds of bugs or spiders or any sharp object I could have laid down on, which yes I understand makes no sense, but what else were we to think? Trish then looked at me and said wait, and put her finger to her lip. She turned off my AC unit, and for the first time in days, the room went quiet. It all became sickeningly clear in an instant, as we both heard a sound from under my bed. The kind of faint sound that you sense from another person just existing in the room. I'm impressed at both of our ability to not scream right on the spot as we both looked at the bed, and then at each other, and then left the room, and then the apartment. We knocked on the neighboring apartment door until he answered. We asked him for help. Someone was in our apartment. He was an older guy, so I don't think we expected him to go fight some stranger in our apartment. He let us use his phone to call 911. At some point while waiting for the police, we heard a door outside slam shut. It sounded like our door. None of us could look out the window in time to see who it was. When the police got there, we confirmed the intruder was gone. We did leave all the lights on in the apartment when we ran away though, and left in a rather sudden fashion, so the intruder definitely knew that we knew. And then came the reflection I had of my dreams, and what they actually meant. That demon in my dreams was supposed to be him, even in the first dream. And with my door being open that night, that means he or she may have been roaming around our apartment that night, possibly eating our food. And to think this person actually scratched my thigh so hard it left a mark, it's actually really disturbing to think about. This forever changed my outlook on dreams and nightmares. This happened when I was a little kid living in our old house in Suffolk County, Long Island. I'm going to say I was about 6 or 7 years old. My older brother and I shared a bedroom on the top floor that used to be a separate apartment that my dad rented out to an old lady. But she moved out, and so the upstairs was mainly for my older brother and I at that point. The layout was as follows. At the top of the stairs, on the left was our bedroom, which used to be the old woman's living room. Straight ahead was the bathroom, and to the right was an extra kitchen and a small bedroom. We had a million toys in our room, as the room itself was huge, and it also had 2 parallel crawl-in closets on opposite sides of the room, where we stored a million other toys and board games and stuff like that. There was one toy though, a race car with a bunch of buttons on it. The buttons would make the car's lights turn on momentarily and play varying sound effects such as honking, revving, and driving sounds, and a little rock song. It was a toy we had for like ever, because it was originally a gift from my brother when he was a little younger. It was a random night. My brother and I were both in bed, not yet asleep, when suddenly, like a jump scare from a scary movie, the loud revving sound of that car toy suddenly activated along with the lights of the car in the middle of the room. I looked at the car and instantly got scared and accused my brother Luke of doing that to scare me. He was laughing hysterically, saying he didn't do it. I was completely terrified. The toy then stopped making noises and went quiet. I was extremely unsettled, as any little kid would be, but nevertheless, time marched on and I fell asleep. It wasn't for a while until something else happened. One night, when Luke and I were both in bed again, we both heard a weird thud in the room. Luke insisted on trying to creep me out, saying there was a ghost in the room or something, and I kept yelling at him to shut up or I'd get Mom. He kept laughing until we both noticed a light in the corner of the room. It was the toy car again. I got out from the bed and ran straight down the stairs yelling for my mom. I got to my parents' room and yelled there's something in our room. I'm sure I gave a little 7-year-old spiel about how there's a ghost in the room, hearing a thud and the lights on the toy car turning on. Luke entered the room, and my mom defaulted to telling him to knock it off if he's trying to scare me. He said how could he turn the lights of the car on from his bed. I slept in my parents' room that night because I was too scared to sleep upstairs. It was a long while after that night, and nothing happened. Not until one night, Luke was not in the room. My guess is he was having a sleepover with one of his many friends. I was sleeping in the room by myself that night. I had long since tucked that car away in the small bedroom across the hall because it freaked me out. After my mom kissed me goodnight, I asked her to keep the door open since I was always scared when I was alone in the room. I rolled on my side and tried to go to sleep, but being that I was scared of being alone, I had a hard time getting tired that night. I felt wide awake. Then there was a sound I can't explain that came from down the hall. I flipped over to face the door, and the toy car rolled into the room with its lights on. I let out a scream straight from the bottom of my stomach as I cried for my mom and pressed my body up against the wall. Moments later, my parents both came up the stairs into the room, noticing the car on the floor. I screamed that someone pushed the car into the room. My dad went to go check the other rooms, but said there was no one there. There weren't any places to hide up there besides the closets and under the beds, and my dad checked all of them. I don't know what my parents thought in that moment. On one hand, they probably thought the toy was malfunctioning, or it's just my imagination. But on the other hand, I think they were also slightly freaked out. That toy car didn't have a feature to move on its own. My dad smashed the toy and threw it in the neighbor's trash to make me feel better. I slept in their room for a while until my dad forced me back upstairs eventually. This story is the reason why I believe in the paranormal and something after death. This happened when I was 18. I'm 22 now. I live in San Antonio, Texas. It was my senior year of high school, but this was when COVID just started blowing up, so everything began to shut down, including my school. Even though everyone was supposed to be staying home and being in quarantine, my friend group and I were going out more than ever. There wasn't much to do, since all the non-essential businesses were closed. But one thing about me, I love urban exploring or exploring haunted places. To this day, I still do. I'm not one to scare easily. I've had a couple experiences with the homeless, cults, even had a gun pointed at me. But nothing compared to how odd and creepy this one instance I came across while exploring was. Moving forward, around this time, I started talking to a girl who I had a class with in high school. Her name was Clarissa. If it weren't for her matching my alibi of what happened this night, I'm sure none of my friends would have believed me. We were still kind of freshly dating, but I somehow convinced her to explore a wooded natural park at 3 a.m. here in San Antonio. The park is called OP Schnabel. It's relatively nice, safe, and very scenic during the day. But at night, it can be a dangerous place, and police usually roam the entrances to the area at night, keeping people away. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Lauren Bump was brutally murdered and stabbed over 20 times, and in 2021, a boy exploring the woods was shot. Clarissa and I get to the park around 3 a.m. It's super creepy and pitch black. The trees do a really good job at covering the moonlight. I don't like to have my flashlight on because then my eyes can't adjust to the darkness, and you can really only see what's lit up from the light. Plus, I wouldn't want someone to see my light from a far distance, so I like to keep them off while exploring. We were probably about 15 to 20 minutes in walking the main trail. I didn't plan to be in there for too long because it was kind of creepy and oddly quiet that night. I knew a trail that goes off the road that leads back to where my truck was parked. I told her we could take that trail, essentially making a full circle instead of walking all the way back around. She agreed, and so we began walking through that off-road trail. We were probably only about 2 minutes into the off-road trail when suddenly, out of nowhere, a flute began playing. Clarissa and I stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other, just listening. Whoever was playing it, it was super in cadence and sounded like it was playing some sort of piece of music. However, there was no time for me to process that it may have sounded good. It was creepy as F***K. As I said before, I don't scare easily, but 15 seconds into the flute solo, Clarissa began trembling in fear and on the brink of crying. I was kind of just listening, but when Clarissa started praying to God to save her and forgive her for her sins, that's when I realized the severity of the situation. To be clear, it was super hard to pinpoint where the sound of the flute was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the previous main trail, which was parallel to where we were, with about maybe 30 to 50 yards of woods in between, but it was getting louder and closer, to the point where it sounded like the sound was right on top of us. Clarissa couldn't even focus because she was so scared, so I knew I had to man up and get us out of this situation. This is going to sound corny, but I told her, don't worry, I'm not going to let anything happen to you, and told her that we should run down the off-road trail to get away. So we did. We began to sprint. I believe the flute stopped playing, but it was hard to notice because I was more focused on getting the hell out of there. We only got about 30 feet, when out of nowhere, we heard the rustling of bushes and the snapping of leaves and twigs, before something big dashed across the trail right in front of us. Now this could have very well been a deer or some sort of bigger wildlife, but it was so strange because I could almost feel the size of whatever was in front of us. I don't know if it was from the wind or what. The only thing is, I never saw a silhouette or shape of anything in front of us. Another strange thing is, I didn't hear it coming and I didn't hear it run away. I only heard the dash right when it was right in front of us. As soon as we felt and heard whatever dashed across the trail right in front of us, we obviously turned back around and bolted in the other direction until we got back to the original point where we heard the flute. And then, as if whoever was playing it was waiting for us to return, the flute started to play again, loud and right on top of us. This time it was almost chiming. It sounded like it belonged to some sort of Irish jigsaw or something, but the chiming was still in cadence. However, it was still impossible to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was just surrounding us. At this point, my fight or flight instincts kicked in because we were trapped. We had two options, either go back into the off-road trail where we heard that terrifying dash right in front of us, or go back to the main trail where the flute and whatever psychopath was playing it was at. The off-road trail was definitely scarier because it was darker and surrounded by more dense forests, and at least the main trail was a cement path. Thus, I told Clarissa, who was still trembling in fear, let's start running down the main trail back to the truck. We ran back. Adrenaline was still pumping, so we cut the 20-minute walk into a 7 to 8-minute jog. And somewhere along the run, the flute noise must have stopped. Along the run back, there was a random porta potty, and I was scared to death because what if someone was on the other side or hiding inside of it, because it seemed to be somewhat parallel to where we were at earlier. Thankfully, I didn't see anyone or signs of anyone ever having been there. In fact, my truck was the only vehicle in the area near the main entrance to the woods. We made it to the truck, and I sped far away from there. The next day, I told all my friends about it, and I looked all over the internet to see if anyone's ever come across anything like this. People claim to run into ghosts, cults, animals making terrifying noises, but a soft and rhythmic flute solo? I couldn't find anything on that. Or maybe I just didn't look hard enough. I tried to figure out all the possibilities. There are some houses that eventually lead into a neighborhood on the far edge of the woods, but those houses are at least a couple miles away, and we were fairly deep into the woods, so there's no way the sound could have traveled that far because, I'm telling you, the flute was clear as day, and it was 3 a.m. Obviously, I never found out who was playing that flute, or what dashed right in front of us. I actually kind of got chills writing this story. The more I think about it, it actually seems more paranormal rather than something scary on a tangible level. I don't know if it was a person, ghost, cult, or what. I'm really hoping someone might have a rational explanation. Either way, I never really went back to those woods at night. I still explore plenty of creepy places, but never really came across anything like that ever again. I'm a 20-year-old guy. I work at a medium-sized hospital in northwest Alabama as a pharmacy technician. I work an early night shift, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. I'm also in charge of stocking the surgery rooms. I work for 7 days in a row, and then I have 7 days off. Working the 7 sucks, but the 7 off feels amazing. I work Thursday through Wednesday, and on my 6th night working, a Tuesday, I left a little early to go stay with my wife at her aunt's house, about 30 minutes away from our house. She was babysitting her little cousins while her aunt and uncle were on a trip. The house didn't have any curtains, so she felt uneasy for the few nights she was there. I didn't go with her at first because it was during my work week, and she told me there was really no point if I was going to get there around 5 a.m. and then go to sleep once the sun started to rise. But on her last night babysitting, she felt extremely anxious, so I told her I was coming over. She is stubborn, but she thanked me and felt so much better once I arrived. Working the night shift for the last 2 years has really taken a toll on me mentally, and I think I've started to develop some slight insomnia. I literally could not go to sleep after getting to my wife's aunt's house. This isn't anything new, but I had never stayed up for more than about 28 hours before. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't sleep because we had a really big day ahead of us. We had to drop her little cousins off at school. Our friend was having a gender reveal party. We had to go shopping because we had no groceries at home since she had been away for the last 3 days, and I had to be at work at 6 p.m. I ended up falling asleep in the car for a little less than 10 minutes. I was really feeling that wave of sleepiness come over me, but I ended up getting a huge Red Bull and another energy drink once I got to work. I had my wife drive me to work and pick me up since my brakes needed to be changed and I wasn't driving my car. And also because neither of us trusted myself to drive her car on over 24 hours of no sleep. It was Wednesday night now, and I had been awake since about 2 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. My shift started out fine. If I could stay busy, that tired feeling wouldn't really get to me. I put in my earbuds and was listening to music as I was stocking the surgery rooms with their meds. It was a weeknight, so there were still some late surgeries finishing up, and housekeeping was cleaning up some operating rooms that had been used. It's not uncommon for surgery personnel to come into the room I was in and grab something that the room they were using may be out of. So I usually turn around and at least smile, and they smile back. I was in my own little world, stocking the Omnicell machine with meds and listening to music when I heard the door behind me open. There was that distinct high-pitched squeal when a door needs its hinges to be oiled. It made the loud crash that heavy wooden doors make when they shut, so I turned around to see who it was like always, except there was no one there. I didn't really get worried about it. Maybe they opened the door and saw I was in there and just decided to go to another room, so I continued on. As I pushed my car to the next room, the light in this room was off. I opened the door, and I swear, I saw someone hunched over by the Omnicell machine, digging through the sharps bin. If you don't know what that is, it's a bin where you dispose of needles and vials after use instead of just putting them in a normal garbage can. Someone had already been caught doing this before in search of morphine, and consequently was fired. I turned on the light and was going to ask what they were doing, but when I turned the light on, there was no one there. Okay, now I was starting to get a little creeped out. I didn't know the time frame of when you could start hallucinating after not sleeping for over 24 hours, so I just told myself I was probably seeing things and needed to just calm down. I finished up stocking surgery with no other occurrences and headed back to the pharmacy. At 2 a.m. every night, we have to deliver patient-specific medications to the nurse's station. I'm going to use the 5th floor as an example of how the floors are laid out, but each floor number corresponds with which floor they were on. There are 3 elevators in the middle of the floor. If you go left when getting off the elevator, there's the 5100 and 5200 side, and if you go to the right, there's the 5400 and 5500 side. There are 2 wings on each side, so there are patient rooms numbered 5105 to 5115, and the other wing has rooms 5201 to 5215. Each floor is laid out the exact same way, so each wing has 15 rooms on each side. To shorten the floor names though, I'm going to refer to them as 5152 and 5455. Recently the 5th floor, specifically the 5455 side, had been undergoing some remodeling, so our overflow floor, the 3rd floor, was where they put the patients who were on the 5455 side of the 5th floor while they remodeled. The 5455 side was empty because there weren't that many people in the hospital that night. I made my way up the hospital delivering meds to the nurses' station floor by floor until I got to the 5th floor. I went to the 5152 side, delivered the meds, and decided to go check out the progress of the 5455 side. As I went over there, I just got creeped out. There were no nurses, no patients, just the long, empty hallways. The surgery rooms are already empty and desolate most nights, so I'm used to walking around down there no problem, but seeing empty patient rooms just creeped me out. I walked slowly down the 55 side. I heard a noise that sounded like one of the hospital beds rattling. As I passed 5512, I quickly found out what the noise was. As I looked into the rooms, I saw an old man violently shaking as if he was having a seizure. Blood was running down his eyes, nose, and out of his mouth. He was making this gargling, groaning sound, almost like the sounds the zombies in The Walking Dead make. A monitor was frantically beeping like it does when a patient is coding. My heart dropped when I saw this, and I took a quick step behind the doorframe. I immediately stepped back into the room, as I realized this man was in desperate need of medical attention. But when I looked back in there was no man. This bed was clean and made. The monitor was off, and there were no signs that anyone had even been in that room for at least a whole day. I thought at that point I was for sure hallucinating. I quickly made my way back over to the elevators, and I made my way back down to the 1st floor where the pharmacy is. As the elevator doors opened, an old man in a security shirt and hospital badge got on the elevator. He patted my shoulder as he walked past me. It was that same man I had seen moments before having a seizure and making those zombie-like noises. He smiled at me as the doors closed, and I watched the numbers on the elevator go all the way up to the 5th floor. I didn't push the button for the elevator to come back down, but the same elevator came back down to the 1st floor and opened. There was no one on the elevator. I ran back to the pharmacy and sat in a chair for the rest of my shift until my wife came and picked me up. As I was waiting, I Googled when hallucinations start when you haven't slept. It said between 30 and 48 hours, and I was on hour 38 of no sleep, so it made sense. The pharmacy is located directly under the 54 to 55 side, so when I walk in, I can see the window at the end of the hospital wing on the 24-34-44-54 side. Sometimes as I wait on elevator on that side to go back down to the pharmacy, I look out the window. As I was walking out to my wife's car, I looked back up at the 5th floor window and saw the same old man looking at me through the window. I got chills as I got into my wife's car. I didn't say anything about what I saw that night. I'm not sure why I would have hallucinated that specific man, as I have never seen him before, and even if I have, he has no significance in my life whatsoever. I'm still not sure, though, if that was even a hallucination, or if what I saw that night was real. It certainly felt real. I went to sleep immediately after getting home. I've not seen that man again, but this was just under 2 weeks ago. I live with my boyfriend in his house that he owns. It's a modest house in a good neighborhood. Violent crime here is typically low. I say it's a modest house because compared to the other houses in the neighborhood, it's on the smaller side, but having a smaller house in this neighborhood is still very desirable because it allows us to still live in a nice town without owning a multi-million-dollar home. It's a single-floor, 3-bed, and 2-bathroom house with a basement. We're on a very quiet block with a lot of privacy. The way the street curves provides this optimal privacy, as when we step outside of the house, there's not a single neighboring house directly facing us. There are 8 houses total on our block. Further down the block is a small wooded area. My boyfriend Mika was away one weekend in Vegas for a bachelor party last October. I was alone from Thursday to Monday. Friday after work, I had some of my girls over for a wine night. At some point while we were in the living room watching scary movies, the doorbell rang. We all went quiet and looked at one another with the same faces. The doorbell ringing late at night while watching a scary movie almost felt not real. I went to go sneakily see if I could see who was outside on the porch, but I couldn't get a view from the window. There is a tiny glass panel at the top of the door, so I peeked through it. There were like 4 cars in the driveway. They had to know people were home, but I didn't see anyone on the porch. I went back to my friends, and while we all agreed that was weird, we accepted that it was just a very unfortunately timed ding-dong ditch. After everyone left, it was late enough for me to go to bed and fall asleep right away. But I was awoken that night, not even an hour later, to the doorbell ringing twice. I looked at my phone, and it was like 1 a.m. No one belongs outside your door at this hour. I immediately called Mika, and he picked up sounding really drunk in a loud bar. He had to go to a bathroom to be able to hear me. Once he heard me, he told me to just stay in the bedroom and not open the door to anyone. He never once suggested calling the police, so I refrained from doing that for now. We ended our call, and I tried to just stay calm and go back to sleep. Just as my heart rate started to slow, and I started to calm down, I heard something from outside. Some kind of clicking sounds, until there was a knock at my window, and a male's voice said, "Hey, anyone home? I need some help out here." I thanked the Lord the blinds were closed. I couldn't see who was out there, and they couldn't see me. Instead of leaving, he knocked again on the window. He said, "I know you're home." This was what prompted me to call the police. I never heard the man outside walk away from the window. For all I knew, he was still standing outside of it. So I whispered the entire time while on the phone, reporting someone trying to break into my house. Call me dramatic or an embellisher, but I was scared and I wanted the police here ASAP. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the doorbell rang again, followed by loud knocks. I went out and approached the front door and asked who it is. A male's voice said, "It's the police." It was a different voice from the other guy. I looked through the glass and confirmed it was a couple police officers. I opened the door for them, and right off the bat, the taller officer in front walked right into my house without my even inviting him in. He said they were responding to my report of disturbance, and I said there's a man lurking around the house ringing the bell and knocking on my window. I don't want to make a big part of my recounting this story about this particular police officer, but he was the rudest man I'd ever met. I felt like he was on a power trip. He was demeaning towards me, telling me to shush and talking over me while I was trying to explain. He also didn't seem to take my claims very seriously. His partner didn't say a word, he just stood in the back. The taller one asked me details that I'd already made clear I wouldn't have, such as what the man looked like when I clearly stated that I hadn't seen him. And the officer actually said to me, "Well, you're the one who called us man. If you don't want our help, we can leave." I was taken aback completely. I'd never called the police before, and I never expected such a lack of professionalism. I apologized and said I'm just scared. It was around this time that the two officers walked around the house with their flashlights. They went full circle and then came back, but honestly they didn't really check very thoroughly. I watched them through the windows. They came back to the door and told me there's nothing they can do if I don't have any cameras or proof of the man trying to commit any wrongdoing. The two cops then left. I didn't feel any better at all besides the fact that maybe whoever that man was saw I call the police. I went back to bed, and thankfully the next time I woke up was to sunlight creeping in through the closed blinds. It was around 10 a.m. It was Saturday, and that night my friend was having a Halloween party that I was going to help set up for. During the day I did a little grocery shopping, and while I was at it picked up some things for the party. My costume was Velma from Scooby-Doo, and my friend throwing the party was Daphne. I got to her house around 6 p.m. The party started at 9, and it really picked up around 10:30. I was there pretty late, like I probably left her house a little after 1 a.m. I was good to drive as I didn't really drink much besides a few beers. When I got home, I immediately noticed a cool draft in the house. After setting my things down on the dining room table, I noticed a window open. I went to shut it, trying to remember why I would have opened it. I went to brush my teeth, but then when I came out from the bathroom, I noticed the basement door was wide open. I froze. This was when I started hearing this faint but consistent clicking sound. As I got closer to the basement stairs, I realized it was coming from down there, and then I got to the top of the stairs, and I looked down to the pitch-black basement, and the clicking suddenly stopped. A voice from below suddenly said, "You're finally home." With that, I slammed the basement door shut and took my phone with me outside. I banged on the neighbor's door until he answered, and I chose to call the police in safety of my neighbor's house. It was unfortunately the same two officers who returned to my house. My neighbor accompanied me as I went to speak with them this time, and I think that may have had some kind of impact on that taller cop's attitude. He wasn't as rude this time. He and his partner checked the house while my neighbor and I stood in the living room. Eventually, after their initial search, I showed them some of the spots I'd imagined someone could be hiding. I basically tore the entire house upside down, while also on the phone with my drunk boyfriend. When I was sure that no one was here anymore, I packed a bag to go stay with my sister until Mika came back. This time I locked every window before leaving. The main takeaway lesson from my story is if you have windows that open wide enough for someone to crawl through, make sure they're always locked when they're closed. We still live in this house today, but for a few months I refused to be alone in the house for extended periods. I still have PTSD from this, and sometimes I have nightmares in which I think I'm hearing knocks at the window, and then I wake up. This is a story of something that my dad witnessed unfold when he was a kid in northern Texas. He was born and grew up on his family's farm until he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. In that neck of the woods, most of your neighbors' farms may be over 5 miles away, but the neighborly spirit of helpfulness meant all one had to do was ask and assistance would be given without a second thought. There was an exception to that rule, however. The 2 landowners located to the north of this family's place had been at war since some said the Civil War. One farmer had been a loyal Democrat and slave owner, while the other was supposedly the head of a recently arrived Yankee family, who was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party. The Yankees were also wealthy, and had purchased a large plot of land that the other farmer had his eyes on for some time. Like so many other families at that time, and in that part of Texas, what started off as a disagreement over politics, the coming war would only serve to worsen. Upon the end of that bloody conflict, and with the return of both men from fighting in it, those in the surrounding area hoped the differences between them would be squashed, but this was not to be. The bitterness that had always been there, seething just below the surface, would break free anew after a dispute over a property line sprang up. Josiah Campbell, the patriarch of the pro-Union Campbell clan, had purchased a 500-acre piece of land just before the war had broken out. This large parcel adjoined to his neighbor to the east, Samuel Johnson's property, but it wasn't until 1883 when Campbell began to put in fencing to keep his neighbor's cattle from encroaching onto his land. Did the already hostile relationship between the 2 landowners reach a new and dangerous boiling point? Multiple face-to-face confrontations would ultimately lead to a court battle in which Campbell would come out the victor. If Campbell believed the court's judgment would be the end of the argument between the 2 families, he would be proven terribly wrong. Many more disagreements, some of them over insignificant things, would arise in the following generations. One of the more notable involved Josiah, now an octogenarian grandfather, in which a stray bullet would come very close to striking him. Although most in the area assumed Samuel, or one of his sons, fired the bullet, it could never be proven. Incidents similar to this would only serve to keep the bad blood between the families just hot enough. My family's part in this drama is small. Financially and politically, our lot was similar to that of the Johnsons, a native Southern family arriving in Texas during the Republican period from Tennessee. However, that's where the similarities ended. What has been passed down through the generations, Samuel Johnson and most of his offspring were ignorant and always looking for a fight. One specific story claims that my great-great-grandfather even stopped attending church because of them. Their attempt at avoiding any involvement in this whole mess was well fought, at least until a quiet morning in 1962, when they would be pulled into it, whether they liked it or not. It was a warm June morning. My dad and his family went to church like usual. Everything was normal that day, except for the conspicuous absence of the Campbell family. The section they had been sitting in since the building of the church was glaringly empty. Because of this, mutterings quickly began to spread throughout the congregation. The Johnsons sat quietly in their own section, doing their best to ignore the rumblings around them. The Reverend waited, but was eventually forced to go on with the service. On the drive home, the family passed the Campbell place expecting to see the bustle of the daily work and those involved in doing it. However, not a soul was seen and the house sat still, showing no life within. My grandfather dropped the woman off at the house, and he and my dad returned to the Campbell place to take a closer look around. As they approached the home, the uncomfortable silence was broken by the slamming of the screen door. It had been left open and free to swing in the wind. The noise brought out the livestock, and their incessant mooing showed they had yet to be fed or milked. If this was truly the case, something had to be very wrong inside. My dad ran into the barn and fed them quickly and rejoined his dad at the door. They were able to enter with no problems. Unlocked doors were still a common practice in those parts, but that would soon change. There were no signs of life in the back part of the house. My grandfather called out, but received no answer. If anyone was still alive inside, the creaking of the stairs as they climbed them certainly would have caused them to stir, but no one appeared. The 2 men separated as they reached the landing, each heading for different closed doors. Just by chance, my father was the first to discover the fate of the Campbell clan. 2 small bodies laid still. In their little blood-soaked beds, John Jr. and William had been shot repeatedly as they slept. Upon taking in the sight, my dad rushed from the room, battling the urge to throw up. He was still just barely out of childhood himself, and yet to have witnessed something so horrible. His father was just about to enter the bedroom of the Campbell parents when his son came rushing from the room. Although no words were exchanged between the two, my grandfather knew what horrors the room behind him likely held. The scene in the parents' room was much like that of the children. Both elder Campbells laid motionless and bloody in their large Victorian bed. They had both been shot with a shotgun to the head, but John Sr., the patriarch, had been shot several more times. So much so, it was impossible to definitively identify him. Despite this, there was no doubt the heinously slaughtered man was indeed John Campbell, and the man behind the shotgun was his lifelong adversary, Matthew Johnson. The ill-tempered Matthew's absence from this morning's service was almost as noticeable as that of the Campbells. The manhunt that followed didn't last long. Matthew's body was found hanging in the loft of the barn, and it was clear that he took his own life. The motive behind the terrible act, more than likely, was the latest in their long string of court battles. This time, the Campbells found it necessary to bring Matthew into another expansive and drawn-out case over the water rights along the long-disputed property line the two families shared. After more than 3 years of fighting, the Johnsons would ultimately come up on the short end of the stick. What would have been just another link in the chain that had connected the two farm dynasties for over 100 years proved to be the end of the Johnson family's hold on their land. It was later discovered that they had been barely managing to keep their heads above water from harvest to harvest, and John Campbell's suit and their eventual loss was the final blow. Once Matthew no longer had anything left to lose, the century-old bitterness between the neighboring families broke free and gave him the justification many of those before him lacked. His family told the sheriff all she claimed she knew. Her husband had stepped out just after sundown, only to return 2 hours later with a substantial bit of blood on his shirt. She stood by their bedroom window and watched as he burned those same clothes. After he finished this, he came to bed and went to sleep like normal. However, the next morning when she awoke, Matthew was not in the bed next to her. She searched the farm, but he was nowhere to be found. The family went to church like normal because she feared their absence would cause people to talk. She swore she had no idea what her husband was going to do when he left that evening, or what he had done when he returned. It was clear he had done something dark, but his target wasn't known. The remaining members of the Johnson family held an auction for their few valuables and vacated the property soon after. Dad said that they were rumored to be living in Wichita Falls, and Matthew's wife had remarried. But once he went off to war, he never heard anything else about them. The ownership of their former homestead and adjoining land was purchased by a big land company out of Fort Worth, who broke the land up into smaller parcels and sold it off to new buyers. As for the Campbell land, the place would sit empty for many years. The slaughter that took place inside, tainting the value of an otherwise beautiful home. That land too would invariably be broken up and become a massive housing subdivision when the area and all the remaining family farms were consumed by the nearby city. The whole sad mess started in May of 2011. I've been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of, and incredibly lonely. So when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, our talks became more personal, and I less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out, and I agreed. I was still a poor student, but even with that, our dinner went well, and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if though I was trying to be a father to him, more of a friend, really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it may bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. Things really hit the fan when her ex-husband arrived unannounced at her house. I wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time, I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many, and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way to not get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed, but if you try to be the hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time her and her son lived there, no words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after, and stayed until they moved out. A few times, her and I would share a passing look, her eyes projecting an air of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move in, just as she had. Many times more, I would witness the abuse, and at least once she knew I had. No one was going to save her, but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail, and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened than a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was the last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feeling of loss, I carry with me the truth is she was always too good for me. An unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least, that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was, it was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family was a little odd. They do very unsafe things, like Chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally, the stars never struck one of them, except for this one time when the girl threw one at her younger brother, and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while, I thought it was because they were half Japanese, and that's just what they did, but as I grew up, I realized that they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around. Not sure how it happened. One day, I was hanging out at their house, and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after, we happened to be wrestling around with each other, and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days, we'd only touch one another's bodies, and some days, it went all the way. We'd been doing our best to hide what we were doing, but one day, her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her on how he found out, but he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me, I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion, so I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment. It was clearly working. I stopped to turn to look and see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it. Again, I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about what I'd been doing, or even admitting I had those type of thoughts, scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me. So I told her I was very thirsty and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure she believed me, but let it go and I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I'd never go over there again, as long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened until I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little harder to mess around in my place. My folks were always around, at least one of them. I was kind of mad she didn't stick up for me, and obviously still shaken from nearly dying, but she was able to take my mind off of all of that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things, and we continued messing around, any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step 1 foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits at holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong, and I expected him to chuck a knife at me any second. My next-door neighbor was the best you could dream of. She worked nights, and when she was off rarely made a peep. Her little dog was a concern early on, but I would soon discover it was as quiet as its owner. I've been at the complex for a year when she told me she found a boyfriend and things were going well. After that, I saw her even less than before and was more than happy to sign another 12-month lease. Things proved to be too good to be true, however. Barely a month into my second year, things began to change drastically next door. Loud arguments were often heard through the walls, and the dog reacted to these as badly as I did. The poor little guy barked his head off while she and the new love of her life screamed at each other repeatedly. I did attempt to ignore the racket for a couple of weeks, but would finally lose my mind and began banging on the wall. I was shocked that it worked, but only the first time. All the others after were ignored. This garbage went on for over 3 months, and after several visits from the cops, she showed up at my door to apologize. She claimed things were going well, just as she had told me prior, but after he moved in, his behavior changed. After that, it seemed all they would do is fight. He had hit her during one, and she foolishly forgave him. He'd sworn it would never happen again, but it did, and she kicked him out. Her hope was that he'd move on to someone else. However, he soon appeared at her door out of the blue, begging her to take him back. The cops were called, and she filed a restraining order. It was almost a month ago, and she hoped he was gone for good. From what I could see and hear, things had gone back to the way they had been originally. I went back to living a peaceful life, and I assumed so had she. Considering we had opposite schedules, it wasn't strange for us to go weeks without seeing or hearing one another, and I was happy for it to stay that way. Then something terrifying would happen one day as I returned from work. I pulled into the complex and turned to enter my section of the lot and was blocked by several cop cars and ambulances. It was a surprising thing to see, but none of my business, I suppose. I found another spot to park and headed for my apartment. As I neared my place, I noticed my neighbor's door was wide open and cops were going in and out. After what she told me, I assumed her ex had showed up uninvited. Upon approaching our building, another officer stopped me and informed me the area was closed. I let him know I lived in the building and asked what had happened. He couldn't tell me, but if I waited for a detective to come out, he'd probably have some questions for me. The cop said something over his radio, and a minute later a guy in a suit came out of the apartment and took me aside. He only had a few questions, if I'd seen anything or the like. As the seconds passed, I got increasingly nervous and begged him to tell me what was going on. He paused and said in a very serious voice that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes had to have looked like saucers to him. I was completely shocked and wondered how I hadn't noticed something so major. Before he could ask the question, I blurted out her ex's name. They were familiar with him, and I could tell from his demeanor he was their main suspect. He handed me his card and let me go. I turned to walk away, but stopped a few steps later. What's going to happen to her dog? The detective hesitated, and a sad look popped up on his face. The assailant appears to have killed him too. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why this angered me so much. Struck me as needless, I guess. The cops probably thought I was crazy, mumbling cuss words under my breath as I walked away. The following morning I was browsing through the local paper online and came across a story about the murder. It explained that my neighbor was a week late on her rent and received a notice. When no reply came after 2 days, the manager visited the apartment personally. There was no answer even after she knocked, so she let herself in and found the body. The detective was quoted as saying that they had yet to find her ex, and they believed that he had fled back to his original home in Lebanon. Not much information has come out since then. The ex-boyfriend is still unlocated, and no other suspects exist at this time. I've moved on to a different apartment complex now, but for the remainder of my time in that one, things went back to business as usual. 2 months before my lease was up, new tenants moved in. This was a young couple with a 5-year-old boy. The noise coming from them was endless, and I was overjoyed when the time came for me to move. The place I'm now in is majority older couples, and the noise level is almost non-existent. As nice as things are at present, I don't believe I'll ever have a neighbor as good as her. Anytime I hear a bang on my ceiling or loud talking through the walls, I think back on her and how great of a woman and neighbor she was. I'm not sure of how common it was in your neck of the woods, but most people I've discussed the subject with had at least one kid whose dad would beat his mom in his neighborhood. My friend Mike was that kid where I grew up. I can count at least a dozen times from memory that I saw his mom with a black eye or busted lip, sometimes both. It was rare that Mike or his brother got knocked around, but if it did happen, the abuse was more in the form of hard spanking or whipping with a switch. I grew up in a rural area in the South in the 1980s. Some folks were just starting to take abuse seriously, but whether it was striking your child or your wife, most didn't want to get involved. You have to realize a lot of the old church people live by the spare the rod, spoil the child motto, and many of them, among others in the community, still believed a woman didn't get hit unless they said something they shouldn't have. It was an odd time indeed, but many others in my community despised any form of abuse and said so as often as they could. My parents were some of those, but let me play at Mike's house anyways. I'd see his dad every once in a while, and he seemed nice. He was quiet and not many words were exchanged between us, but I never saw any reason to be afraid of him, no matter what the adults around me told me. However, I did tend to be around later in the day after he had a few beers. Unfortunately, one day I would stay too long and see the man for who he truly was. That day, Mike and I had been playing a game on his Nintendo. I can't remember which one, but I got distracted and didn't notice the sun was going down. Back then, I could go anywhere in the neighborhood as long as I was back by dark. I had lost track of what I was doing, and the next thing I knew I was running late. Cell phones were not a common thing in those days, so my mom couldn't just pick one up and tell me to come home. I started to panic because I knew I'd be in trouble. I threw down the controller and said bye to Mike. When I got up to open the door, Mike's dad flung it open and asked me where I thought I was going. I told him that I was late and needed to get home. The entire time I was respectful and even called him Mr. Hughes like my parents had taught me to do when speaking to adults. He replied by saying that I was just a stupid little rat because I was already there. The words were slurred as he said them and confused me. I looked over at Mike, bewildered. His expression showed utter fear. I wasn't sure what to say, so I said nothing. I stared back at Mr. Hughes, hoping he was just playing a joke on me. His next words were, "What's wrong with you? Cat got your tongue?" These were just as slurred, and he swayed as he said them. That's when I saw the beer in his hand, and I became very afraid. If I could have shrank in size and rolled away, I would have. With the knowledge I had surrounding how he acted when drunk, I was sure I was about to be beaten for nothing. His eyes were very glassy, and he looked around hoping for someone to speak, but we were too scared. "Well, if you're not going to talk to your old man, go outside and help your brother pick up stuff out of the yard." Instead of looking at Mike when he said this, he was turned toward me. I could only assume he mistook me for Mike. The real Mike was sitting just behind me on the floor, well within range, but I guess he was so drunk Mike was invisible. Or maybe he was so used to seeing double he thought that that was the case of that moment. I was about to correct him before I saw this as my way out. I did as he said, but rather than stop to help Mike's little brother, I booked it 3 houses down to my own and hid in my room. I got lucky that night. Neither of my parents heard me sneak in, and when they came to check on me, they assumed I'd been in my room the entire time. After weighing the pros and cons of telling them about what had just occurred, I chose not to. It wouldn't have achieved anything other than putting more unneeded stress on Mike and his family. So I let it go and counted myself fortunate. I'm not sure what happened when I left. Mike never mentioned it. The situation did teach me a lesson, however. I stayed away from his house, at least until his folks got divorced and his dad moved out. The family's life greatly improved after that, and Mike graduated valedictorian of our class. The man that would marry his mom later was an exact opposite of his father and became the dad he'd always dreamed of. In the years since my childhood, the attitudes towards domestic violence has improved greatly. I for one can say I'm very pleased to see it. Children living in fear can never be a good or godly way to be. Because of this, I know I can be far more confident that my son and his group of friends will be less likely to find themselves in the same situation that I did. I've recently had to move to a new apartment because of a terrifying incident I had with another resident at my former one. He had become obsessed with me to the point that he tried to kidnap me at knife point and end my life. He's currently on remand in jail and will be for at least the next few years. However, his family is still living in the same apartment, and they have threatened me and my family more than once. My mom decided we would be safer if we left that complex, and in the middle of the night last week, we packed everything we could fit in our car and slipped away. I suppose it wouldn't be fair to end the story there, so I'll include all that I can remember that led up to the attack. My mom and younger sister had lived in that particular apartment for around 7 years before I moved in. I'd been living with my dad in California since my parents' divorce. I liked living there and didn't want to leave my friends. The only real negative was that I hardly ever got to see my sister. We both missed each other a lot, so I made the decision to move to Arizona with her and my mom. The day I arrived, I noticed a group of older boys, about 18 or 19, hanging out in front of their apartment. One of them sat under a tree staring at me. There was something about the way he watched me that made me very uncomfortable. This was Brett, and he would be the boy that very nearly took my life. Our first few times to see each other, he kept his distance. It would take around a month for him to introduce himself, and it was the circumstances that forced his hand. We ran into each other at the mailboxes. The surroundings pushed us very close together, and our eyes met. I still remember the feeling I had of indecision as I looked into his eyes. On one hand, he was a very handsome guy, but that deep down feeling of mistrust was still there. He stared for a long moment before he finally introduced himself, and I did the same. He offered his hand, and we had a very awkward shake. That was the beginning of a short, but eventually terrifying friendship. Our first day hanging out would be a fun one, and no indication of how things would turn out. Brett remained shy for a little while, and on this day he wouldn't say much. I found myself making small talk to avoid any silence. He had told me about a wooded area close by that the other older kids hung out in, so I asked him to show me around. When we walked up, there were already 3 other kids, 1 boy and 2 girls, hanging out smoking. Brett and I stuck around for a little while and smoked with the group. By the end of that day, everything went well, and I had made 3 new friends. He and I continued hanging out at the clubhouse, as the wooded area was called, and were getting along great until the day he asked me to be his girlfriend. The question caught me off guard. Honestly, although I thought he was good looking, I wasn't attracted to him. We had become good friends, and that was the way I wanted things to stay. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I tried to let him down as softly as I could. He took the no much better than I expected, and quickly changed the subject, but did so in the most horrible way possible. He had seen a tabby cat walking about 30 feet away, and picked up a handful of rocks. He began throwing the rocks at the poor creature. Fortunately, he missed each time. I was naturally appalled by this, and yelled at him. He kind of just blew me off and walked away. With no one else to hang out with, I headed home, unsure of our friendship going forward. We ran into each other later in the week, and tried to put what would have happened behind us. Brett's brother and a few others were swimming at the pool, and invited us to join them, so we did. I ran back home, and put my favorite swimsuit on. I rejoined them and jumped in the pool. I was having a good time splashing around with the others. It was over 100 degrees that day, and the water felt great. I had stopped to get a drink of water, and was talking to one of the boys I had just met. Out of nowhere, Brett ran up to the boy and pushed him into the pool. Everyone, including the victim, began yelling at him, but rather than apologize, he walked off just as he had in the woods. When I caught up to him later, I asked why he had done it, and he said he had become overwhelmed with jealousy. He had seen us speaking to each other, and I looked like I wanted him to be my boyfriend. A shudder of horror ripped through me when I heard this. If I was smart, I would have run away at that moment, but I felt sorry for him for some reason, and assured him I had no intention to do that. The smile and look of sheer relief on his face should have been another red flag, but we've already established I'm not very smart. The rest of the day went fine, and nothing creepy would happen for another week. We had been playing Fortnite and smoking in a friend's apartment that afternoon when Brett tried to steal a kiss from me. This made me mad, and when I began yelling at him, he put on a sad face to make me feel sorry for him. If this would have been the first time he had tried that, I may have let it go, but he had tried just the day before in the woods. No one was around to see it then, but this day a room full of people saw. That was the final straw. I told Brett off and left. I never intended to speak to him again, but he arrived at my door the following day like nothing had happened. I let him say hello before I slammed the door in his face. My hope was that he'd get the point and leave me alone, but within hours, the apology text began and would continue for at least another week. I very nearly answered one just to tell him to leave me alone, but my sister convinced me it would only give him hope, and he'd never stop after that. The messages eventually stopped on their own, and for the first time in almost a month, I had reason to hope it was all over. Things around the apartment soon began to quiet down, and there were no signs of Brett outside. Being cooped up inside so long was starting to drive me crazy. Therefore, after I scanned the area around outside my place and across the way for Brett, I deemed it safe and took the short walk to the mailboxes. I stepped out of the door, walking slowly at first, ready to run back inside at the first sight of him, but the closer I got, the more confident I became. A few pieces of junk mail were all that greeted me. Feeling a tad more relaxed, I inhaled a lungful of hot Arizona evening air and made my way back to the apartment. I took a moment to tie my shoes. As I did, I thought to myself that this would be the perfect time for Brett to walk up, but when I finished and walked on, he was nowhere to be seen. I could see my door when I turned the corner, and then, out of the near darkness, Brett stepped out from behind the wall and grabbed me. His hand quickly covered my mouth before I could scream, but when I felt the sharp point of the knife, I lost any will to. He shuffled us back behind the wall and told me he needed to talk to me. When we were safely hidden, he slowly pulled his hand away. I could tell he was watching and waiting for me to make any noise. However, the presence of the knife resting just under my neck prevented me from doing any more than whispering. He claimed he wasn't going to hurt me. He only wanted to talk to me and explain how he felt about me. The knife made me think otherwise. I asked him as quietly as possible if that was true. Why was he attacking me with a knife? This is the only way I could get you to listen to me. His reply was quick and confident. The Cheyenne Reserve Brett was elsewhere. The knife had apparently instilled him with a sense of power that he lacked without it. This realization terrified me even more and left me with little doubt he would use it if he felt a challenge to that power in any way. I decided at that moment I was going to do anything necessary to get away from this alive. Well, I'm listening. What do you want to tell me? When I said this, I used the softest feminine voice I could muster. I also relaxed my body to give him the idea that I was complying willingly. He said there were far too many distractions where we were. He was going to take me to the clubhouse so we could be alone. I stifled the chill as well as I could. The only thought I had was that he was going to take me there and kill me. If this was the case, I was going to attempt to get free whenever I could, even if I had to kill him to do it. He followed behind me as we walked towards the woods, pressing the point of the blade firmly against my spine the whole way. As we traveled, he told me about how he had fallen in love with me the second he saw me, and how angry he felt any time another guy talked to me. I said nothing this entire time. In truth, I was doing my most to block out what he was saying and looking for my chance to get away. We drew closer, and I could see a campfire burning off in the distance. My God, how long has he been planning this, was my only thought. When we reached it, we sat together on a long log. He stared longingly into my eyes and talked about how much I hurt him by refusing to be his girlfriend. He had held on to that hope that I would see we belonged together and got the idea if he kissed me, I'd realize it sooner. For a brief moment, I forgot how I had been brought there and a feeling of pity crept in my mind, but it was fleeting and the seriousness of my predicament returned. What he would say next convinced me that my earlier suspicions were true. Our time apart had proven to him that I would never really be ready to accept our destiny together, and he was a fool to ever think a girl so beautiful would ever want to be with a screw-up like him. A dream he had showed him that if we died together, things would be better. When he said this, he hid his face and tears began falling from his eyes. He raised his hand with a knife in it to wipe the tear away, and that's when I took my chance. That split second he looked down and took the knife away from me was all it took. I turned and began running as fast as my legs could carry me. It was dark, but I had made the walk back and forth enough to know what set of lights in the distance belonged to home. Only once did I dare glance back. He was uncomfortably close, but I gave it all I had, knowing if he caught me I was dead. I neared the edge of the trees and could see the lights of the complex growing closer. I began screaming for help. The burning in my legs was becoming unbearable, and I knew I couldn't go much further. The parking lot neared, and then poof, a mass of bright lights flooded all I saw before me, and I ran into something. The something grabbed me and picked me up. For a second, I thought he had caught me and this was the end. I screamed as loud as my burning lungs would allow me. I was not going to die silent and meek. A voice calmly told me it was all over and put his hand on my head. I looked up one last time, confident my defying eyes would be the last thing he saw, but the face was not Brett. It was an older man with a bushy mustache. Our eyes met. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. You're safe now." His words were the sweetest I'd ever heard. I went limp and wailed with relief, a relief I hoped to never exceed. The nightmare was finally over. My mother and sister wrapped their arms around me. We held each other tightly and cried like babies. They got worried when they saw the male on the ground and called the cops. I glanced over to see a police officer with his knee in Brett's back putting handcuffs on his wrists. Another led us over to a waiting ambulance where I was checked out and eventually cleared. Brett was taken away, and when the time came to determine his bail, it was decided not to give him any. So, at least until the trial dates, he will be stuck in jail. God knows that's where he belongs. Since this all happened, we had repeated problems with Brett's family. They hold me responsible for what occurred, like I'm some heartless tramp that led him on and caused him to have a nervous breakdown. They egged my mom's car and broke our windows. Even after we called the cops on them, we had no proof they were the people doing it, so they got off. The entire situation became more trouble than it was worth, so we moved to our new place. It's only been a few months since this occurred, and from what the district attorney tells me, it'll likely be over a year before the trial begins. Any updates won't be for a long while, however, if anyone is interested, I'll post any new information I get. Please, everyone, wish me luck, and for all that is holy, let's pray this monster never gets to victimize another girl in his life. Has your neighbor ever once tried to kill you? Mine did. Wanna guess why? Because my dog defecated in this yard once. Once? Yes, once. This dude has been nothing but trouble since I moved in. He would strut around without a shirt on in summer and occasionally flex, and then look around to see if anyone was watching. He would think a guy trying to appear as macho as possible would be a man's man, but this was not the case. Anything that required any real physical labor, except for lifting weights, was done by his wife, a woman who was maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. I may have given him a pass on the lawn mowing. Maybe he had bad allergies, but that wasn't it. They owned this ridiculous jacked-up truck with an annoyingly loud exhaust. And you know who did all the maintenance on it? The wife. She had to use a stepladder just to get in the thing. When I realized he was just something to look at and had no bite behind his bark, any fear I may have had of him faded away. None of the small talk, though. The point of this whole post is what happened one quiet Sunday morning as I stepped out to get the paper. 9 times out of 10, my wife's little furry rat of a dog, who's actually pretty cool, follows me out of the door when I go to retrieve it. This morning was one of the 9, and while I searched the fading darkness for my paper, he pranced off to the grassy area alongside the driveway to relieve himself. I thought nothing of it at the time. It's something that happens occasionally, and when I notice he does, I return from the house with a bag to pick it up. Not even I like dog feces in my yard, but I generally don't go super scion when I see it. They gotta go somewhere after all. Anyway, after I found it, I returned to the house with my paper. I noticed out of the corner of my eye the yappy bugger was in the familiar stance, and I'd have to come back and pick it up. So I grabbed a bag and head for the door. This had to have been 30 seconds from dump to door, maybe. I reach the door, and before I can grab the knob, my neighbor comes banging on it. Not a kind knock either. This is 7:30 in the morning. Everyone else in the house is still in bed, so his loud knocking and yelling, yes, there was yelling too, made me angry before a word was even said between us. I open the door, and he starts ranting about how my dog just took a huge one in his yard. I automatically tell him to lower his voice, but he kept on with the yelling. I tried to explain to him what I was doing. I even showed him the bag, but he continued. I push past the idiot and go to pick it up. When I find the pile, I see that it's actually well within the bounds of my property, so I get even angrier than I already was. I dispose of it in a nearby trash can and turn to go back in. This whole time, I'd been swallowing my feelings, but then he made a big mistake. He threatened to hurt the dog if it ever came into his yard again. This was something I couldn't let pass. I may make jokes about the little thing, but my wife loves him like he's her own child, and I love my wife, so even if it was only a threat, I knew my wife would be upset if she heard it. I got in his face and started yelling threats back at him. When he began poking me in the chest with his finger, I reflexively pushed him away, and he fell right on his back end. He stared at me speechless with a look of shock on his well-moisturized face. Now that he'd shut up, I assume he got the point, and I could finally go back inside my house. I foolishly thought that was the end of it, at least for the time being. However, less than 2 minutes later, he starts pounding on our door again. By now, my wife had awakened and was in the kitchen asking me what was going on. I forgot to mention, this whole time, that furry bugger was barking his head off. My wife picks him up to calm him down, and I storm to the door, ready to strangle this idiot. When I yank the thing open, the psycho is standing there with a gun and actually takes a shot at me. Just by a hair, the bullet zips past my head and comes incredibly close to hitting my wife. How he missed at that near of a distance, I don't know, but I'm incredibly thankful he did. I slammed the door closed and expected more shots to come roaring through, but none came. I ran for the phone and saw my wife had already called the cops. They tell her that there's been a few calls from the area and cars had already been dispatched. They show up, and we tell our side of the story and show them the bullet in the wall. The guy couldn't deny he'd fired a gun. The proof was right there, and a few of the other neighbors had made complaints about someone shooting, so they put the cuffs on him, and we watched as they took him away. Later in the day, his wife came over and apologized to us for all the problems. I've never had a problem with her in the first place, and told her so. She thanked me, and let me know that they were going to be moving. The truth of the matter was they couldn't afford the house anymore, and with what he'd just pulled, they were going to need all the money they could to hire a lawyer. She didn't say much else after that, just apologized once more and left. Less than a week later, they were gone. It wasn't long before another family moved in, and they've actually been great neighbors. Although the entire comedy of errors was what it took to get rid of him, I'm still not sure my wife and I almost getting killed was worth it. The scariest experience I've ever had in my life took place about 5 years ago. It all started when I was driving home late at night. It was a little bit past 11 p.m., and I was still about an hour away from home. I was driving on a rural road out in the country a little bit. There was farmlands and woods in the surrounding area, and not many cities or businesses nearby. At the time, I drove a car that was almost 20 years old. It had some problems, and I'd been meaning to buy a new car, but I just hadn't gotten around to it yet. I was really busy with work and stuff, and car shopping can be a hassle. But on this night, as I was driving along a quiet road, my car started to break down. I didn't know what the problem was at the time, but it turned out it was an alternator going bad. This caused the battery in my car to die, and my engine felt like it was losing power. Soon, I realized that I would have to pull over and call my roadside service. But when the car came to a complete stop and I took out my phone, I wasn't receiving any kind of a signal. It didn't really surprise me given the fact that I was kind of in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't sure what to do. It really didn't look like there was any gas stations or businesses nearby. I also didn't see any houses immediately nearby. To my right was a little bit of trees and woods, and to my left was just a big field. I restarted my phone and kept trying it, hoping that somehow I would get a signal. I didn't know enough about cars to try and work on it myself. Meanwhile, I hadn't seen another car on the road at all. The thought of trying to hitchhike did come into my mind, but I quickly pushed that thought away. I knew how dangerous that could potentially be. There had to be a better way for me to get out of this situation. My thinking at the time was to let my car sit for a while and try to start it again in about 10 minutes. Again, I didn't know what the problem was at the time. I thought maybe it was overheating or something, and I could let it cool down. I probably sound dumb to anyone that's a car expert, but clearly I'm not one. Plus, I was only 20 years old, and basically a kid. As I sat there alone in the dark and quiet night, I couldn't help but feel really creeped out. I only heard some crickets and frogs in the distance. There was no street lights or anything either, so it was very dark out. As time went on, I was starting to get a little bit paranoid. Then about 5 minutes later, I saw headlights of another car coming down the street from behind me. I looked back, and as they approached, I saw that was an older-looking sedan. This car had to be at least 25 years old, so it was even older than mine. I expected the car to drive right past me, but I noticed that the car was going slower and significantly slowed down when it got close to me. I didn't know whether to feel nervous or relieved, and I can tell you right now that I was feeling a lot more nervous. Sure enough, the car pulled right in front of me to the side of the road and then stopped. Then, the driver's door opened and a man got out. He looked to be in his 40s or 50s and started approaching my vehicle. I opened my door and got out. He asked me what the problem was, and I said I wasn't sure, but my car just broke down. The man said that he knew of a gas station just a couple of miles up the road and offered to give me a lift. I really didn't want to accept a ride, for I asked to borrow his cell phone to call my roadside service. The man told me that these areas had weak signal, and that wouldn't work because he couldn't get any signal here either. I thought about what to do. Then, I asked the man exactly how many miles it was to the gas station. He said about 4 or 5. If I walked there, it would probably take me about an hour just to get there, and then another hour to get back. I realized that it made a lot more sense to just accept the ride from the guy. Chances are he would be fine and a good person, although for some reason he just gave me a bad feeling immediately. Reluctantly, I accepted his offer, and he told me to get in the passenger side of his car. When I got inside, I saw that the car was in fact very old. I'm not sure exactly what kind of car it was, but it was probably from the 1980s. It smelled badly of cigarettes, and there was a bunch of empty beer cans in the back, which did not set me at ease in the slightest bit. I buckled up and thanked the man for giving me a lift, trying to make good conversation. He said no problem, and then began driving. For the first part of the drive, though, he didn't say anything. I wasn't really sure of anything to say either. I was feeling kind of awkward, and nothing was coming to my mind. We kept driving down that road, and it was more of the same scenery, just trees and wildland on both sides. After at least 5 minutes, I figured that we would have to come up on a town or something, but we didn't. I finally had the courage to speak and ask the man if the gas station was coming up. He said yes, and it would be pretty soon. I remember that I asked him what kind of gas station it was for some reason, and he said he wasn't sure. At least another couple minutes went by, and I was feeling that something was off for sure. We hadn't passed any gas stations or anything like that. I said to the man this is farther than I thought it would be. I then told him that I felt bad making him drive all this way. He just said that it was fine. The man was not very talkative at all. Each minute that went by, my heart was beating faster, and I was getting more nervous. Soon, I finally saw a gas station up ahead to the right side. That had to be it, but this certainly was more than 4 or 5 miles from my car. We had been driving for at least 15 minutes. I asked the man if that was it, but he didn't respond to me. He just drove right past it. When he did, my heart sank. I had a terrible feeling, and said to the man that I thought he missed the gas station. Again, he still didn't answer me. Now I knew something was very wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I just wanted to get out of that car. Even sitting in my car on the side of the road stranded would be better than being in that guy's car with him. I wanted to do something, but I wasn't sure what. After another minute or so, I pulled out my phone. I turned it on and looked at it and saw that I still had 0 bars. But as I was noticing that, the man finally spoke again. He said in a stern voice for me to put the phone away. I did out of fear. We were traveling probably about 50 miles per hour down the road. My thoughts turned to jumping out of the car to the side of the road. There was a grass ditch on the right and a very small shoulder only a few feet past it, but that would still injure me. I looked at the man's door, and the car was so old that you could just pull up the lock to unlock it. I considered doing it, but we were just going too fast. About another couple minutes went by. Now I had been in the car with the man for like 20 or 30 minutes total. I had no clue where he was taking me or what he was doing. He hadn't spoken or said anything in a while. Then I saw a sharp turn coming up ahead. The man would probably have to slow down significantly because this was really sharp. I felt like this was my big opportunity. He began slowing down, and when he got to the turn, we were probably only going like 20 miles per hour. As soon as he hit the middle part of the turn, and we were probably traveling the slowest, I turned to my right. I reached and unlocked the door, then opened it all within the span of like 2 seconds. Then I jumped out as far as I could. When I hit the ground, my feet hit first on the edge of the road, and my body then tumbled into the grass of the ditch. It hurt pretty bad, but could have been a lot worse. I just felt a little bit shaken up and was able to get to my feet. I saw the man's brake lights and heard his tires screeching. I knew I needed to get out of there, and I took off running into the woods. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as possible. The woods were not very dense, but it would still be really hard to see me with how dark it was. I kept running as fast as possible and never heard the man running after me or leave his vehicle or anything like that. Soon I was able to slow down and walk instead of run. I saw a light in the distance and followed it. When I got closer, I noticed that it was a light coming from the front step of a house. This house was certainly out in the middle of nowhere, but I was very happy to see it. I went to the front door and pounded on it. The homeowner luckily was home and answered the door. I asked them to call the police, which they did. They didn't let me in the house, but said that I could wait in the driveway. That was fine with me, because I felt safe enough that the man wouldn't come back. It took about 10 minutes, but the police got there and I told them everything. I was able to call my roadside service and got a ride back to my vehicle. To make the rest of the story short, I got home all right that night. It was extremely late, but what mattered is that I was back and that I was safe. I ended up getting a new car shortly after that as well. I honestly don't know whatever happened to the man. I just hope that he didn't pick up anybody else. I'm not sure where we were going, but I feel lucky to have made it out of there. I used to work in a Blockbuster video store many years ago. When I had the job, I was about 18 years old. My main job was working as a cashier, and typically there would be about 2 or 3 of us working at once. I liked all of my coworkers and was friends with most of them. One night, I was working with Lisa, who was my same age, and we had gone to the same high school. We closed at 8 p.m. on weeknights and 9 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. This was a weeknight, and it had been a pretty quiet day. For the last hour or so of our shift, we only got one customer. Both myself and Lisa were tired from the long day, and we were excited to go home. When it got to be 7:50 p.m., we decided to just close early. Now, we weren't really supposed to do this, and we were supposed to stay open until 8, which was our official hours, but we didn't think anybody else was going to come in. I went over and looked out into the small parking lot and made sure nobody else was there. It was just my car out there because Lisa had gotten a ride there, and I was going to be giving her a ride home. I locked up the doors, and then we waited until 7:55 to clock out and actually leave. We had already done the cleaning that we were supposed to do and made sure that everything was in order. The store wasn't all that big and was pretty easy to maintain when there weren't too many customers. When it was 7:55, Lisa and I left the store and headed for my car. We got inside my car and drove through the parking lot to a larger connected parking lot. Then we would take the exit onto one of the main roads, but as soon as we got into the bigger parking lot, I noticed that another car was pulling into the Blockbuster lot. The car drove right up to the side of the building in front of the door and then stopped. I stopped the car because I was curious to see if the people were going to try to get inside. Maybe they were just going to return something, is what I figured. We watched the car stop, and then all of the passengers' doors opened and 3 men got out. They walked up to the front doors and seemingly tried to go inside. I felt kind of guilty because the time was only 9:57 now, and technically we were still supposed to be open, but we had left a little bit early. But at the same time, going to a store 3 minutes before they close is a bit risky as well. The men stood around the door for about 30 seconds or so. The car had driven a little ways up, and then the men turned to go back to the car. When they turned around is when I noticed that they were all wearing ski masks. We were kind of far away, and from the back it looked like they were just wearing hats or sweatshirts with hoods. They all returned to the car, and then the car began to drive away immediately. Lisa and I couldn't believe what we had seen. Had those men been trying to get inside and rob the store? Why else would they go there with ski masks on? Suddenly we were both really happy that we had closed early and left. Maybe we narrowly avoided a disaster. Of course we didn't know for sure, but it seemed pretty likely. The next week Lisa and I found ourselves working together on another weeknight. This night had been a little bit busier, and we were occupied pretty much right up until close. The thought of closing early hadn't even came into our minds. It was finally just before 8 p.m. and the time to get ready to close. We hadn't had any customers in maybe 10 minutes at that time. That's when I went to look out the front doors, and when I did I noticed a car driving up, and I got a bad feeling for some reason. That's when I realized it was the same car that we had seen the previous week. I scrambled to lock the doors as quickly as I could. The car casually drove into the parking lot, and then up to the side of the building. It got closer, and I just barely got the doors locked before the car pulled right out. I jumped back, and then hid behind a display before they would see me. I told Lisa that the same car was here from the previous week. She asked if we should call the police. We decided to wait and see if they had ski masks on again. Sure enough, they did. 3 men got out and walked right up to the front door. They tried opening it, but it was locked. I was hoping that they wouldn't be able to see me. Lisa ducked down behind the counter. I looked at my watch, and the time was 8:54. Then one of the guys knocked on the front door. I heard somebody say, "I know you're in there, let us in." I started to feel really scared then. They must have seen our cars parked right out front, or possibly had seen me as they drove up. I knew that I wasn't going to open the door for them though. Then one of the guys said, "Open the door, or we'll have to smash it." Lisa was near the phone, and I hoped that she would call the police. I didn't want to yell out to her, or I would give away my position. I tried to crawl from the display that I was hiding behind into one of the aisles, but to do so I might be partially in view of the men. I sat there for a few seconds before finally jumping to the aisle. When I did, I heard one of the men say, "I see you." I ran through the back of the aisle, and I heard Lisa say that she had called the police. One of the men started to then bang on the door as if to try to break it. I ran through the aisles and eventually made my way to the counter where Lisa was hiding. Then I got behind it with her, and we both took cover. The police would arrive any minute, and we just had to wait then. The men stopped banging on the door, but stayed there for a few more minutes. At last I heard a siren in the distance, and then the sound of the men scrambling to get back in their car. We heard a screeching of tires, and then the car drive away, and not long after that, all the police were there. We told them a description of the car and everything that had happened. It didn't take long for the police to catch up to the men in ski masks. I don't believe they got in too much trouble though, because they didn't actually break in, but just threatened to, but it was pretty obvious what their intentions were. Luckily they never came back after that. I used to be a janitor for a high school. It was a job that I only had for about a year, and this was back in 2019. The job was not too bad, but I moved on to other things later. For the most part, when I worked as a janitor, I would work overnights in the high school, and typically was all by myself. I would start at 9 o'clock at night and get off at 5 o'clock in the morning. The high school was large, but not so big that I couldn't manage it. With all that time, and the whole place to myself, I could clean everything that I was supposed to. A few times, due to events on the school campus, there were some people there around the time I started, but they would usually be gone within an hour or two. I would do the things that you would expect: mop floors, vacuum, sweep, and maintain the bathrooms. Not every room in the school required attention daily, so it's not like I was cleaning every single classroom every night. I would even have some downtime where I would just go on my phone or whatever. It was honestly a decent job. The only downside was that I had to be nocturnal and work overnights and sleep during the day. The other downside was that I was all by myself all night in a school, which sometimes felt sort of creepy. Most of the lights would be on, and a lot of them were motion-detected lights, so they would turn on when I went near them. One night, I was working in a random hallway cleaning the floors. It was probably about midnight or 1 a.m. I remember that I thought I heard footsteps coming from not that far away. I looked over but saw nothing. Now the footsteps might not have been in my sight and come from around the corner. I walked over wondering who was in here. As far as I knew, I was all by myself like always. When I made it to the end of the hallway, I looked around but saw nothing. I went back over to where I had been and continued work. Maybe I had just imagined it. I wasn't 100% sure because it hadn't been very loud, but probably 10 minutes later I heard footsteps again. This time I knew I was hearing it. I looked at the end of the hallway, and when I did, saw a man walking by. I only saw him for a couple of seconds because he walked past the hall to another. He was only visible for a short amount of time. I could tell that it was a man though, and seemingly an adult, but beyond that I couldn't really tell any details because he was kind of far away. I started walking over and called out asking who was there. Nobody was supposed to be in the school at this time. Nobody answered me when I called out though. When I got to the end of the hallway and looked, he was gone. There were other hallways that he could have gone down though. I walked a little ways farther looking around and asking if anybody was there, but I saw no one and didn't hear anything either. After that I wasn't really sure what to do. I just ended up going back to work where I had been. Some time went by and eventually I moved into another hallway. Probably 3 hours or so after the last time I saw the guy, something else happened. This time I was facing the end of and out of nowhere I heard this noise behind me. I couldn't really tell what it was. I turned around and looked back and saw a basketball rolling right in my direction. It went past me and hit a locker. When I looked up to where it had been rolling from, I didn't see anybody. I suspected that whoever was in the building stood at the end of the hallway that I was in and rolled the ball towards me. Then they moved away out of my sight, but why they did it I had no idea. I picked up the hallway to where it had been rolled from. I called out once more asking if anybody was there. Still nobody answered me. I stood there in silence looking around for like 5 minutes. I didn't see or hear anything at all. Somebody was messing with me, but I didn't know why. I mean, they weren't even supposed to be here in the first place. Once more I went back to work. From that point on I wasn't bothered again for the rest of my shift that day. Just before I was done I decided to walk all around the school to look for the person. I went into every wing and hallway and asked if anybody was there in each one. I even checked all of the bathrooms, but nobody ever answered me, and I didn't see anyone either. At 5 o'clock in the morning I got off, and another janitor got there. I told him about what had happened and asked him to keep an eye out for the guy. Then I left the school and drove home. During this time I was living in a small house by myself about 10 minutes away from the school. I got back and my typical routine was to go to bed and get some sleep. It was strange to go to sleep at like 6 a.m., but I got used to it. So on this day it was probably 5 minutes after I got back home and I was in my kitchen. That's when I heard a knock on my front door. Instantly I was confused. I walked over to the living room and looked out of the front window. Nobody was there. Just off in the distance I saw a guy walking down the street. I saw him for just a second or two before he went out of my sight. It looked like the same guy who had been inside the school. I was so creeped out. I didn't fall asleep for hours, but luckily the man never returned, and after that day nothing like that happened in the school ever again either. I still wonder though who he was and what he was doing. This happened to me last summer. It was during a road trip that I was taking from my home in Ohio to New York. It started out well. I was making good time. The weather was great, and I was enjoying the views as I made my way down the freeways. I had decided that I would try my best to do the whole drive in one day, because it was about an 8-hour drive for me. I already had a hotel booked, and I was on pace to get there at about 10 p.m. until I hit some traffic about 5 hours into the drive. It eventually cleared up, and at about 9 p.m. I was only 2 hours away from my hotel. But that's when things started to get strange. The roads were much quieter now with it being dark out. I was driving in the right lane with my car on cruise control. I was kind of zoned out just driving and listening to the radio when I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. There was a car next to me, and I realized that it had been next to me for seemingly a while now. I looked over at it and could see that the car seemed to be going the exact same speed as me, and that I was perfectly aligned with the driver's window, so I could see inside the car. When I looked over, I saw that the driver of the car was looking right at me. This car was a black cheap SUV, and it looked a little bit old. His front passenger side window was rolled down, allowing me to see him pretty clearly. The driver looked to be a man wearing a baseball cap and big sunglasses. He was just staring at me. Then he started to point. I watched him point at me, and I was really confused. I gave a little smile thinking it was a joke, and then focused my eyes back onto the road. I could tell out of my side vision, though, that the man was still pointing at me. Not only that, but he seemed to be motioning now. I looked over again. Now the man was pointing at me, and then moving his hand around a little bit. I thought maybe he saw something wrong with my car, like maybe a flat tire. I looked at the guy with a confused face. The guy was still pointing at me, and it appeared as though he was motioning for me to pull over now. It seemed weird to me, and I kinda had to get gas anyways. I was at a quarter tank, so I decided at the next exit I would pull off. As I drove down the road, the man remained next to me. I kept seeing him look over or make more hand gestures to me. I took the car off of cruise control because this guy was starting to make me really uncomfortable, but when I slowed down or sped up, he would quickly adjust his speed to match mine. At last, after probably 5 minutes, I saw an exit, and I took it. I put my turn signal on a little bit late, just in case the guy was going to try to follow me. When I took the exit, though, he didn't. I watched him just keep driving down the freeway. I was relieved and figured maybe he was trying to point something out that was wrong with my car. Either way, it was a rather strange way of doing it. I entered a little town with a gas station a short ways down the road and pulled into it. It was nice and a pretty big gas station. I was able to fill up my tank and then got out of my car to examine it. When I did, everything seemed fine. I looked all around it. My tires weren't low. My license plates were on all correctly. Taillights and headlights were also working. I didn't know what the guy was gesturing about. I just shrugged it off and decided to finish up my drive. I only had about an hour and a half left until my hotel, and I was starting to get tired. I left the gas station and then took the ramp to go back onto the freeway that I had been driving on. As I drove down the ramp and was beginning to merge back onto the freeway, though I saw a car pull over on the side of the road up ahead. When I got closer, I recognized it to be a black Jeep. It was just sitting there. Could it be the same guy? As I approached it, I saw it start to move again, and after I passed it, I saw that it was now merging back onto the freeway. My heart dropped. Were they waiting for me? I kept driving and watched them speed up and then start to drive next to me again. Once again, the guy rolled down his window and started looking at me. This time I rolled down my window as well. He was motioning for me to pull over, and I yelled out my window to him. I asked him what he wanted, but I didn't get a vocal response, just more pointing. The guy's face remained expressionless the entire time I saw him. I don't know why, but I decided to pull over. I thought maybe something was wrong with my car, and I just hadn't seen it when I looked at it. I was definitely no car expert by any means. I slowed down, and so did the man. Eventually, I came to a stop on the side of the road. I saw that the Jeep slowed down and pulled over to a stop maybe 50 feet in front of me. We both sat there stopped for a few seconds, then all of a sudden I saw the two rear doors of the Jeep open up. Two large men came out and started approaching my vehicle quickly. The men were both wearing jackets and had on baseball caps and sunglasses as well. As they got closer, their pace changed from a fast walk to a jog. I put my car back into drive at that point, and when they were maybe just 15 feet away, I pulled back onto the freeway and drove away. Luckily, no other cars were going down the freeway at that moment. I sped away, and as the men realized they wouldn't reach my car, they turned and ran back to the Jeep, which still had the driver inside of it. I floored it and was able to put some ground between myself and the Jeep before the guys got back inside of it. I could see it start to drive again, and I kept driving. I went a ways down the road, and the Jeep was still pretty far behind me. I noticed an exit and immediately took it and began driving down random roads. After that, I took a different route to get to my hotel without going back on that freeway. I didn't see the Jeep again, and it took me almost an hour longer to get to my hotel, but it was well worth it to not run into those people again. This is something that happened 2 months ago. I live in a quiet neighborhood and often go on night walks. I've always been a night owl, and the warmer climate that I live in makes it uncomfortable to go on walks in the heat, especially during that time of year. Other times it's okay. It might seem a little bit strange to go walking late at night, but those are my reasons, and I've been doing it for a long time. So anyways, I usually just walk the neighborhood, and I'm out for maybe 30 minutes to an hour at most. There's a sidewalk that I walk on that goes down all the streets in my neighborhood. I usually also never see anybody else outside, obviously, because of how late it is. I didn't walk every single night, but probably 3 or 4 times a week. One night, I went out walking at probably 10 p.m. I walked to the end of my street where it intersects with another. Then I walked down that street. Both of them are residential and really quiet, especially at night. I walked down this street for a while, and maybe 10 minutes later was coming to the end of it, and then probably going to turn around and go back. That's when I heard what sounded like a car coming from behind me. I turned around and saw a car with no headlights on approaching. The car was driving extremely slow. I kept walking, not thinking all that much of it. I expected it to pass me by, but after a few seconds it didn't. I looked back again, and the car was a little bit closer to me, but still behind me. The area on the sidewalk that I was walking was now not very well lit. The street lights were less frequent here, and I was starting to get a bad feeling about this situation. About another minute went by, and I was still walking on the sidewalk, and the car hadn't passed me, but it was getting closer very slowly. It must have been driving less than 5 miles per hour because I was walking sort of fast, but not that fast. Soon though, the car finally made it even with me. I hesitated to look over, but I did. The car was a 4-door sedan, somewhat old-looking and dark gray in color. When I looked over, I also saw that there appeared to be only one person in the car, and it was a man driving. He looked over at me, and I saw that the guy was wearing a black ski mask. Now I was even more suspicious. I kept walking, and he maintained speed with me. After about 30 more seconds of that, I came to a stop. I decided to turn around and go back home. When I stopped, the car stopped as well. Then I started walking back, and I watched the car start to turn around. When it did, I knew that I needed to get away. I wouldn't be able to outrun the car either. It quickly got back up to even with me again, and it looked like the car was starting to pull over. I was walking in front of somebody's house, so I turned and walked right up their driveway to the front door. The car stopped and was parked out front. I knocked on the front door to whoever's house this was. I didn't even know who lived here, but I was hoping that they would answer. Even though it was a little bit late, luckily they did. A woman answered the door and asked what it was that I wanted. I turned around to show her the car that was following me and started to tell her what was going on. When I did, the car on the side of the street suddenly sped off, screeching its tires in the process. We talked about it briefly, and I felt better now that the car was gone and I was talking to somebody else. I said that I should be able to make it home all right now, and then left the woman's house. I got back onto the sidewalk and carefully looked around. I didn't see the car anywhere. I started walking back home as fast as I possibly could. I was also looking around the whole time to make sure that I didn't see the car anymore. Eventually, I was able to make it back to my street, and soon was just a short ways from my house. When I was maybe 100 feet from my own driveway, I looked to the very end of the street and saw the car coming. It was really far away and driving slow. I started running as fast as I possibly could, cutting through my front yard to make it to the door faster. I made it there, unlocked the door as quickly as possible, and then went inside the house. I slammed the door shut behind me, and then looked out the window. The car drove by at an extremely slow speed. It passed by my house though and drove away. It felt so much better to be safe inside. I don't think whoever was driving the car watched me go inside, or at least knew that I lived there. At least I hope not. I haven't seen that car since. I also have stopped walking outside late at night after that experience. I'm not sure who that person was, or what they wanted, but I'm glad that I got away from them. A couple of years ago, I lived alone in an apartment. It was on the 4th floor of the building, which was a pretty typical apartment building. I think it had 5 floors total, and was relatively old and close to the city. My apartment was 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom with a kitchen and a living room. It wasn't that big, but had everything that I needed for just me living there. I guess after about 3 or 4 months of being there, one night, I woke up in the middle of the night. I remembered that immediately I heard some sounds as if there was somebody else in my apartment. I thought I heard footsteps of somebody walking near the front door. I sat up and turned my light on. The noises seemed to stop after that. I sat in bed for a while before I felt brave enough to get up and open my bedroom door. Eventually I did. I looked out into my dark living room and kitchen. I turned on the lights, and everything seemed normal. I must have been hearing things or something. After looking around my apartment and double-checking to see that the door was still locked, I went back to bed. Nothing else that was strange happened for like a month, but then almost the exact same thing happened again. I was woken up in the night, hearing noises inside my apartment. This time I sat laying in bed, trying hard to listen to the noises to detect what exactly they were. They really weren't that loud, but it did sound like somebody was walking inside my apartment. All of my lights were off inside, including my bedroom, so I really couldn't see a thing. I thought about reaching over and turning on the light, but I was just really focused on listening to the noise. Was there somehow a chance that I was hearing something other than what it sounded like? Maybe I was hearing someone on the floor above or below my apartment, or maybe I was just hearing random noises that buildings make. But no, this was for sure the sound of somebody walking around in my apartment, and now it sounded like the footsteps were right outside my bedroom door. Then I heard the door handle start to turn, and I heard the creak of my door opening. I thought my heart would pound right out of my chest. I got really hot and sweaty as the door opened. I looked right at the opening. The door got about halfway open, and I saw the figure of a man standing in the doorway. He appeared to be looking right at me, but I couldn't tell any details about him at all in the dark, just that he was there. I was sitting up in my bed, and he stood there for maybe 10 seconds before I couldn't help but let out a scream. When I did, the man backed up and shut the door. I was screaming like a crazy person for like a minute straight. By the time I composed myself, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived at my apartment a while later, and when they looked around, whoever had been in my apartment was now gone. There was no evidence left behind, and there were no signs of forced entry. My door was still even locked. None of my windows were open or anything like that either. I was so puzzled by this. I knew what I had seen though, but all I was able to give was the description of a man that was sort of tall. I couldn't tell anything about him really. It was like 2 a.m, and the police left. I barely slept at all for the rest of the night. I didn't know what to do. I worried that I was going insane. Over the next few days, things got a little bit back to normal, but I was worried for something like this to happen again, and then an idea came to me. I went to the store and I got 2 things. The first was a lock for my bedroom door, and the second was a motion-detecting security camera. It was a little bit expensive, but I needed answers. I set it up inside my apartment, facing the door in most of the kitchen area where I'd heard the footsteps. I hid the camera as best as I could on my bookshelf. Then I set up a lock on my bedroom door, so I would feel more safe as I slept. I set the camera every night before bed, but for the longest time nothing happened. Of course I was happy about this, but at the same time I was always a little bit worried about whoever it was returning. I would say it was like maybe 3 weeks since the last incident, and then something happened. I was once again woken up to hear what sounded like the door to my apartment opening. I heard footsteps once again, but this time they were really fast. They went straight towards my bedroom door, and were much louder than before. Whoever it was tried opening the door, but this time it was locked. They tried violently and quickly, turning the knob several more times before stopping. I screamed that I was calling the police. This caused whoever was there to walk back and straight out my door. As soon as they left, I got up and ran out to get my camera. I went back into my bedroom and locked the door again. From there I watched the footage. It had recorded the entire thing. When I played the video, I saw a man walking right into my apartment as if the front door wasn't even locked. When the man walked in, I recognized him. It was my next door neighbor. I didn't know the guy well at all, but I knew that his name was Jim. I had only briefly said hi to him one time in the hallway. After seeing this, I called the police again. They arrived and had remembered me from before. This time I had evidence to show them. When they watched the video, they went next door and confronted Jim. At first he was pretending to be asleep and that the police woke him up, but when he was told there was video evidence, he seemed to get angry. He flat out claimed it wasn't him and denied it, but then later changed his story that he must have been sleepwalking. The police weren't buying it and took him in. I'm really glad they did, because he later admitted to being awake the whole time, and the way he was able to get inside my apartment was because he somehow had a spare key. How he had an extra key to my place, I'm not sure, but I'm glad I don't have to worry about him anymore. During a time when I was done with college and wasn't able to find a job right away, I took a job at a 7-Eleven because I needed money. I worked mostly late night and overnight shifts. What I liked about this was that there wasn't many people that came in, and I would have a lot of free time by myself to play on my phone or listen to podcasts. I was always a night owl, but I didn't really like staying up all night when I would have to work those hours. Anyways, I'd been working there for maybe about 2 months, and one night I was working by myself very late. It was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but I don't remember the exact time. The location that our 7-Eleven is at is on a road just off the highway, and we're really busy during the day, but not so much at night. We got several customers early on, and for the first few hours I had quite a bit to do actually, but now we would get only like one person every 20 minutes or so, and I started to get bored. I noticed in the back corner of the store, where we had the soda machine and icing machines, there was a spill on the floor. Seeing as though we didn't have any customers, I decided to go over and mop it up. I left the counter and walked over to the back near the bathrooms where we kept the mop, then over to the corner where the spill was. I saw the spill looked like Coca-Cola. Thankfully the floor hadn't gotten all gross and sticky yet, and the mop was working well. As I was mopping, I suddenly heard the sound of the front door opening and somebody walk inside. Realizing I wasn't at my counter, I rested the mop against the wall and looked over to see who had entered our store. Where I was, you couldn't see the front door, and whoever was in the front door couldn't see me either. I could, however, just see the front counter. I saw somebody standing at the front counter with their back to me. They seemed to be looking around, as though they were looking for someone who worked there. Realizing I needed to go back there, I took a couple of steps over to them, and as I did I noticed them turn, and their head went to the side. They hadn't noticed me, but I did see them looking to the side, revealing that they were wearing some sort of mask. It appeared to be a really creepy-looking clown mask. I then noticed that he was wearing a dark blue jacket, and his right hand was in his pocket. Immediately I got a bad feeling, as if he was up to no good and possibly looking to rob the place. I froze in place, telling myself to stop being scared for no reason and to just go. I thought, what are the odds he's trying to rob the store? It had never happened before, but as I was standing there I watched the man then go around and behind the counter himself. As a pure reaction to this, I jumped behind the nearest aisle and hid. I could hear the man messing with stuff behind the counter, and it sounded like he was going through the cash register. I figured he was in fact robbing the place, and as I was hiding back there I decided to call the police. I got out my phone and dialed, but as soon as I heard the 911 operator answer the phone, I suddenly heard the man go quiet from whatever he was doing and say something. Out of fear I quickly hung up the phone and held my breath. I heard the man shout from behind the counter asking who was inside and to come out now. He spoke in a loud and demanding tone. I wasn't going to, though I was way too scared to move. At this point I just wanted to get out of there. I knew our store was being robbed, but they didn't pay me enough to try to stop this guy. I just wanted to call the police again, but obviously the man could hear me if I did. I heard his footsteps moving out from behind the counter and get a little bit closer to me, but then they stopped and I didn't hear anything. I was not moving a muscle, and I was being as quiet as I possibly could be. Then I heard the door to the building open and shut. I guessed that the guy was leaving because I didn't hear anything else for about a minute after that. Finally I got up and slowly took a few steps out. I still heard nothing. I knew this had to mean that the guy was gone. I walked over to the counter to examine what exactly the man had done and how much he had took. When I got there, though, I passed by the front of the counter where I could see clearly outside. I saw that the man was standing right in front of the door looking inside with his creepy clown mask still on. I jumped back when I saw this, and the man started to walk inside. I ran back towards the end of the store where I had hid before, and I heard the man come in and shout at me to come out and stop hiding like a baby. His footsteps were fast approaching mine, and I knew I probably wouldn't be able to hide from him this time. I was ducking down and quietly moving through aisles to try to from the man. This continued for probably a minute, and I knew I couldn't keep this up for much longer. I could hear where the man was, but suddenly I heard the man yell a curse word and then run back to the front and leave the building again. I was confused, but this time decided to stay hiding. Out of curiosity, though, I took a quick peek outside. This time I saw a police car in the parking lot, and it turned its flashing lights on as I saw another car starting to drive away. I stayed hidden until I saw the police stopping the man, and I knew it was safe. I guess my call to the police had gone through, even though I hadn't been able to speak with them. Luckily the man was caught, and after this night I decided I didn't want to work overnights again. I still worked there for another few months, even working late shifts, but didn't have to work by myself again. I'm a female and have an Instagram account like many other people. I post pictures on my page here and there, and I always enjoy seeing how many likes and comments that my pictures get. Most of the comments and likes are from my good friends, but of course not all of them are. Like many other people, I've experienced several creeps online. Sometimes random men will like my pictures, comment on them, or even send me direct messages. They can get kind of creepy, and sometimes I even delete them. For the most part though, I don't really care. It happens here and there and doesn't bother me. I remember though one time about a year ago I posted a picture on Instagram and some guy liked it and commented on it. I read the comment, but didn't bother to click on his profile or anything. I did not know him, but he commented something like very nice with a fire emoji, but not long after this he sent me a direct message as well. He simply said hi to me, but I had no interest in responding. I did click on his page though to see who he was. He looked much older than me and only had a few pictures. I had no idea who he was, and we didn't have any mutual followers, so I ignored him. I've gotten many direct messages from people who I don't know, and most of the time, I don't respond to them. They usually get the idea and leave me alone after I don't reply. I figured this would be no different, but the man sent me another direct message the next day. This one I also ignored. I didn't even open it. Over the next few days, he sent several more messages to me. I didn't bother to read any of them, and I figured eventually the man would give up, but he didn't. Over the next week or so he sent me messages basically every single day. I would get Instagram notifications several times a day, and at least one of them would be from the man sending me another message. Eventually I got tired of it and decided to finally block the guy, but before I did I wanted to read through the messages that he sent me. Right away I saw that he had sent a photo, and it was my house. I realized that this was no ordinary creep. This man must live in the area, and he somehow knew where I lived. I looked at the other messages that he sent me. He said hi to me over and over again, and then blatantly told me that he knew where I lived. That was followed by a picture of my house, and then him saying hi to me again. I wasn't quite sure what to do. I reported his account to Instagram and then blocked him. However, I wasn't really confident that anything would be done. I didn't think this was worth going to the police either, because I didn't think that the man had broken any laws. Still, I was now very worried. What was this man capable of? I found myself looking out my front window almost constantly for the rest of the day. I lived by myself in a 2-story home near a major US city. For the rest of that day, I did not have to go anywhere, and I did my best to stop worrying. I called several of my friends and spoke with them about it. Unfortunately, none of them could come over and keep me company that night because they were either working or had prior plans. I started to feel better when nothing strange happened for a few hours, but then nighttime came. At around 10 p.m., I was in my living room watching a movie on my TV. By now my windows were covered with the shades, and I wasn't thinking about the guy as much. My phone hadn't received any strange Instagram notifications either. Part of me had been worried that the man would make another Instagram account and message me again, but that didn't happen. At one point during the movie I randomly remembered and had the thought to check out the window again. It had been several hours since I had last checked. I turned behind me on the couch and carefully lifted the blinds back. That's when I saw a car parked right out front on the street that I did not recognize. Could that be him? With it being dark out and stuff, obviously I couldn't tell who was driving, but I could tell that there was a person in the driver's seat. I quickly covered the window back up and wondered if the person had seen me. I sat there on the couch for a few moments thinking of what I should do. Then I heard a car door open and shut. The person was getting out. I carefully moved the window shades again, just barely, just enough to see out. I saw a man walking towards the house through my front yard. This was definitely him. He walked up closer to the house, and I heard him moving just outside of my window. I couldn't believe that this was happening. I really hoped that he would not try to break in. I heard him walking further down to behind the house. This time I was calling the police for sure. I took out my phone and dialed. I stayed where I was on the couch and spoke with the police as I waited for them to arrive. During this time I didn't hear or see anything indicating where the man was. Several minutes later though, I heard a car door open and shut again outside. I was hoping that it was the police arriving, and I looked outside, but instead I saw it was the man driving away. I was so glad that he was gone, but I also knew that the police would not be able to catch him right away now. They arrived about 5 minutes later. I told them about the man leaving and gave the best description of him and the car that I could, but I didn't get a very good look at either. I still didn't feel that confident about him being located. I gave the police the whole story, but I had blocked the account, and when I looked at accounts that I had blocked, it must have been deleted because it was gone. After the police left, I was still very worried. I decided that I would stay at one of my friends' houses for the next few days. This was a big help to me because I knew that the man still knew where I lived and he might return. The very next night, I got a direct message request from a random Instagram account. The username was user and then a bunch of random numbers, and it had no profile picture. They sent me just a photograph, and it was of my bedroom window. It was taken from my yard. That must have been what he was doing. I showed the picture to my friend, and we went to the police with it, but I don't know that there was much they could do. The account had no pictures or any information on it. They did say that they would investigate, though. Several days went by without anything happening. I decided that I would return to my house. I drove back there in the morning, but when I got there I noticed that it had been broken into. The window to the back door had been smashed. I called the police immediately and ran back outside to my car in fear that the man was still inside my house. They arrived very quickly and entered my house. They were inside for a while, but soon they came out with the man. He had been hiding inside of my house. I guess he had broken in the previous night and was waiting for me to return. I'm so glad that he was caught, and I will never forget that experience. I'm a female and recently moved into a new apartment. It's not too far from where I previously lived, so I know the city well. I really like my place and live in a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of the building. When I first moved in about 3 weeks ago now, I didn't have much furniture. Where I lived in the past, I had roommates who owned a lot of the bigger things like couches, tables, and lamps. After getting into my apartment and bringing all of my things inside, I realized that I needed to go shopping for some furniture badly. Over the next few days, I looked at countless websites online. I knew what I wanted for most of the things and did get a couple online, but I found that there was a lot of good furniture at IKEA. The IKEA store was a little bit outside of the city and about 15 minutes from my apartment. So on Saturday morning I got in my car and headed to IKEA for some basic furniture and decorations. I had been there a couple of times before and knew what to expect. The place is massive and you could easily spend hours in there. I probably got there at like 10 a.m. and sure enough was there for about 2 hours. I looked at so many different things and ended up getting a decent amount of furniture and objects. The time that I was there, the store started out relatively quiet, but picked up as the day went on. When I was just about done, things were pretty busy. I saw a lot of different people. When I finally left, loaded up my car and headed home. I was excited to get back and finally decorate my apartment. It took me a couple of trips to bring everything up, but once I was in, I started the job of building a few pieces of furniture. I furnished my apartment for most of the day, taking breaks here and there. That night, though, as I was hanging some artwork on the wall, there was a knock on my apartment door. I had no idea who it would be. It was like 10 p.m., so kind of late. I walked over to the door and looked through the little peephole, but nobody was there. This was strange because I hadn't really met any of my neighbors yet, and none of my friends were coming to visit me or anything. I opened up my door and stepped out into the hallway to look around. However, I didn't see anyone. After that, I just went back inside and continued on what I was doing. I finally finished for the night about 10 minutes later. Then I sat down on my couch and relaxed by watching something on TV. But it was then that my cell phone started to ring. It was on the couch next to me, and I felt it vibrating. I picked it up to see that there was a call coming in from an unknown number. I had a terrible feeling instantly. I didn't bother to answer it because I had no clue who it was, although I somehow felt like it was connected to the random knocking at my front door. Whoever called me did not leave a voicemail. For the rest of that night, they didn't call back whoever it was. I went to bed maybe an hour later, but that very same night I woke up sometime at about 3 a.m. or so. At first, after waking up, I just rolled over to my other side and closed my eyes to go back to sleep. I was not wide awake or anything, still pretty sleepy, but that's when I thought I heard the sound of somebody trying to enter my apartment. It was the doorknob turning, but it didn't open because of the door being locked. After hearing that, I was now wide awake. I wasn't sure what to do, but I didn't hear any noise for a few minutes. I decided to get up and go investigate. Without turning any lights on, I quietly walked over to my front door. When I looked through the peephole this time, there was nobody there again. I did not go out into the hallway to look, though. I was too scared to do that this time. I just walked back into my bedroom and attempted to go back to sleep, but it took me a little while. Eventually, though, I did. A couple of more strange occurrences like this happened over the course of the next several days. None of them were as eventful as the first night, but 2 days later I got another phone call from an unknown number late at night. Then the very next night, there was just 2 knocks on my front door. It was a little bit earlier this time, at like 8 p.m. When I went over to look out, once again nobody was there. The next night is when I started to figure out some things, though. I got another random knock on the door late at night, and when I looked through the peephole again, like always I couldn't see anything. I just saw white when I looked through. I was very hesitant to open my door. I was afraid that somebody would be right there or something, so I decided not to go out, but about an hour later I hadn't heard anything more that strange, so I decided to go out and look. When I opened up my door, no one was there in the hallway, or anything, but I saw that somebody had taped a white envelope to my door right over the peephole. I grabbed it and then went inside. When I opened it up, there was a handwritten letter. It was very creepy, to say the least. The letter seemed like it was from a sort of cryptic stalker. The person described how they had seen me the other day. They said they regretted not talking to me, and asked if they had gotten my attention now. They also asked me why I hadn't answered their calls. I was beyond creeped out by this, but it doesn't end there. The next morning when I got up, I checked my phone. I had a text message from a new number. The texts were just a few pictures and videos. I saw the pictures appeared to be me when I was inside of IKEA. Most of them were zoomed in and taken from kind of far away. I had no idea that they had been taken either. There were a couple of short and shaky videos as well. They maybe lasted about 5 seconds or less each, and they showed me walking in IKEA. I realize now where this person had probably first seen me. After seeing these texts, I took some screenshots and then decided that I would go to the police. That very same day I went and reported everything. I was told that they would look into it, and I'm really hoping that they find the person, whoever it is. That was not long ago at all. So far the person has not been found yet, and I have no clue who it could be. The good news is that I haven't been bothered by them since. Nothing strange has happened at all. No random phone calls or texts. No knocks on my door or anything. I just hope it stays that way. This happened just a couple of months ago. I was on Facebook on my phone one night, as I would be on almost a daily basis. I was scrolling through my friends' posts and looking at news and other stuff for a while. I was kind of bored, so I just decided to click on the Marketplace tab to see if there was anything cool on there. I had used Facebook Marketplace once in the past to buy a phone, and it worked out really well, so I would go back and look to see what they had occasionally. I saw the average stuff you see. Cars, phones, laptops, and other random junk. Then I saw an ad for a free TV. It looked like a newer TV, and I was actually kind of wanting to get one for my bedroom, so I clicked on the ad. I was wanting to see if the TV was broken or had a problem with it, and that's why it was free, or if it was good and working. When I clicked on it, I saw that it was a 50-inch TV. The picture showed that it was standing on the floor of a carpeted room, and they had one of the TV arms showing that it worked. The post was made by a woman named Barbara, and she said she was moving out and didn't need the TV anymore, but it worked just fine. When I looked, the listing said it had been posted about an hour ago. I responded to the post asking if the TV was still available, and if so I could pick it up at the earliest convenience. I got a message back from the owner about 10 minutes later. Barbara said that yes it was, and if I wanted the TV I could come and pick it up the next evening. We agreed on 8 p.m. and it was set. I was really excited to get the TV because I knew it was most likely worth hundreds of dollars, and I had been thinking of buying one soon. The next afternoon I messaged Barbara to confirm, and she told me just to let her know when I was there, and she would let me in. I went to work that day, and when I got off I went home for a while before leaving for Barbara's. She had given me her address earlier in the day, and she seemed like a very friendly person. I put the address into my phone and followed the instructions on getting there. It wasn't too far away, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. When I got to the neighborhood, it seemed pretty average. A little bit farther out from the city, and the houses seemed to have a little more length. I then turned onto a road which had a sign that said dead end. I kept driving, and when I got to the end of the street, it led to a single skinny driveway, which according to my directions was Barbara's house. The long skinny driveway led right up to a detached garage with an old-looking pickup truck parked in front of it. I decided to drive into the driveway because I didn't want to carry the TV that long of a ways to my vehicle, and I thought it would be easier. Once I parked, I messaged Barbara telling her that I was there. She responded almost immediately saying that I could come right on in, and the TV was on the floor in the living room. I got out and walked up to the front door. It was dark out by now, and as I approached the door I noticed that all the lights in the house appeared to be off. It seemed a little strange, but I got to the front door and slowly opened it. It was unlocked, and when I got inside I couldn't really see anything. I looked around on the wall for a light switch, and had to turn on the flashlight on my phone after I couldn't find one within a few seconds. Finally I found one, and I turned it on. A very dim light in the corner of the room appeared. I could see that it was an old living room with lawn carpet and some furniture. I didn't see a TV at all inside, and I suddenly started to get a bad feeling. I walked a little bit farther into the house. There was a kitchen off the living room which looked pretty average, and then a hallway leading to a back door, and another type of living room appeared. There was also a staircase going upstairs, and one going down to the basement. I couldn't find the TV anywhere, and the place was giving me the creeps. I opened up the Facebook app and messaged Barbara again, telling her that I couldn't find the TV, and confirming the address with her asking if it was correct. I waited in the silent house for her response. I was getting the urge to just leave. Finally, I got a response from Barbara. Barbara said, yes, it's the correct address, and then she said, sorry, I meant the upstairs living area. There's a staircase in the living room you can take. I got suspicious, and was wondering why Barbara didn't just come and talk to me, and why she wouldn't have mentioned to go upstairs right away. I walked towards the stairs anyways though, but as I was about to take my first step up, I heard someone walking to the front door of the house. They were outside and turned around, and saw the screen door open up, and the front door to the house, which I had left half open and swung shut. All I saw was an arm closing it, but not the person. It appeared it was a man's arm, and after the door shut, I heard someone start to come up the stairs from the basement. I walked away from the stairs, and then went to the back of the house. I was really creeped out now, and once I saw the back door I made a run for it. Just as I heard whoever was coming upstairs from the basement move faster up the stairs. Once I got to the back door I opened it, and went outside. It was tall grass, and I saw many trees and wildflowers. I ran sideways through the backyard until I was in the neighbor's backyard. Then I went through a few more yards. I basically walked through a few people's backyards, and then past someone's house to get back to the street. I looked from there at the house I had just been to. I couldn't see much in the night, but my car was there, and I knew I needed to get back to it. I then looked at my phone, and saw several messages from Barbara. She said come back, and she asked me why I left in all caps. I certainly did not want to go back there, but I walked slowly down the street to get back to my car, which was parked in a driveway. Once I made it to the front of the driveway, I didn't see anybody in the front yard at all. I then sprinted to my car and unlocked it. When I got inside, I saw that my front windshield had been smashed and the glass was all shattered. I backed out of the driveway, and as I did I appeared to see a man looking at me from the front window of the house. He had a sort of evil smile on his face. When I got back I reported Barbara and what had happened. I really don't think Barbara was even real, and it was probably that guy that was looking at me through the window. I think I might have walked into some sort of setup, but beyond that I have no clue what was going on there. This took place a few months ago, but I still don't know what it was. I'm too scared to go back to my house, so I'm renting a place on Airbnb. I've been trying to understand what happened ever since, but I still have no answers. Here's some background. So I moved into a new house, and right across the street is an abandoned manor. I know it sounds cliché, but that's what made me want to get the house. I've always been interested in abandoned places, especially ones with creepy stories. For example, this manor was owned by the same family for years, but in the 1900s, all the last family members living there mysteriously disappeared at the same time, and it's been abandoned ever since. I thought that was pretty cool at first. Everything was fine, and I was really enjoying my new place. But then I got curious about the abandoned manor. I felt like I had to check it out, so I managed to get inside, and right away the vibe felt wrong. I can't explain it, but something was off. I felt like someone was watching me. So I went back to my house with my heart racing for no reason. I've never really believed in supernatural stuff, so this was a bit strange for me. I think that's when things started to change. Whenever I walked home late at night, I felt like someone was still watching me from the manor across the street. Then soon after that, I started hearing sounds in my house late at night while I was in my bedroom, especially in the kitchen and living room. I didn't think much about it, because I'd always hear these sounds when I was about to fall asleep. You know when you're just about to sleep, and you hear things in the background, but it almost feels like it's part of your dream. Well, it was always like that, so I could never be sure if I actually heard something or if it was in my dream. But why would I dream about dishes being moved or someone walking around my home? Now fast forward to last night. I was sleeping in the living room because my bedroom gets really hot during the summer. So I grabbed my blankets and slept on the floor, something I've always enjoyed doing since I was a kid. I got everything ready, turned off the TV, and all the lights in the house. When I turned off the light in the living room, I got a very uneasy feeling. So I hid under my blankets and start scrolling through funny videos until the feeling went away. Yeah, I know it sounds silly. I instantly felt safe under the blankets, so I put my headphones in my ears. But I didn't plug them into my phone yet, because I was still looking for something to watch. I got distracted scrolling through Instagram and looking at funny memes. Then I heard a voice in the corner of the living room, and I froze. I couldn't move or do anything. I was too scared to even make a sound. I heard something say, "There's one thing you don't seem to understand." Then another voice said the same sentence, but the words overlapped, and I couldn't make out the rest because they were talking at the same time. It started with one voice, then two, then three, and so on until it became confusing. The whole time my body was frozen in shock. I didn't know how to respond. I can't even remember exactly what I was thinking. Then suddenly, all the voices stopped all at once. A few hours passed, and I was still frozen in the same position. My body felt so uneasy that I wanted to move my leg or do something, but I was still too scared to even do that. Just as I was gathering courage to move, the voices started again. It began with one voice, then two voices at the same time, and so on. They were saying, "You don't seem to understand." Now I wished I could hear more. But with so many voices speaking at once, it was hard to understand. This time, I wasn't going to miss it. I carefully moved my fingers to the closest app one could use to record. I started recording a video so I could listen back and see if the voices were real, or if I was imagining things. After I finished recording, I forgot that my recorder automatically played back the video. So when the video played out loud, my heart stopped. Because whatever was in the corner of my living room now knew I had recorded it. As soon as it played back, I quickly plugged in the headphones, and all the voices stopped at once. But at least I have a recording now, so I can confirm I'm not crazy. Even though that just made it worse, because now I know something is really there. Another hour passes, and I'm terrified. By the way, I still want to move my leg, as several hours have passed at this point. It's really hot under the blankets now, and it's the middle of summer, so I'm sweating a lot. But I won't dare to peek out from under the blankets, because I'm scared of what might be out there. Things start calming down again, and I decide to watch something funny, just to make it through the night until morning. The next time I opened my eyes, it was morning. I told everyone about this weird incident, but as you already knew, no one believed me. They all thought I was just imagining things or dreaming. Now I can't stop thinking about what happened, and I'm too scared to stay in that house. I think I need to move to a new place, or I will lose my mind. In 2018, my 3 friends and I, all guys in our early 20s, decided to go to Bali for a week. It was a cheap trip, and we had the time, so we thought, why not, right? So we planned to see the sights, try local food, climb a mountain, visit beach, and do all the usual vacation stuff in Indonesia. It was honestly a very unreal experience. The country is really beautiful, and the food was amazing, but the only problem I had was with the locals. There were people constantly trying to sell us things on the streets, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but that was just the beginning. The real trouble started when we went back to our Airbnb for the night. We had an early start the next morning, and were very tired. The place was super cheap, and didn't even have a proper lock on the door. The Airbnb had 2 wooden doors that swung inward, and the only way to lock them was by putting a wooden block through the holes in the door. It was a pretty basic lock, but it worked, I suppose. Everything was fine until the last night of our trip, when we noticed the wooden block was gone, so I thought maybe one of us had accidentally left it somewhere. We ended up using a selfie stick. I know, not the best idea, because we didn't have anything else to fit into the holes to keep the door closed. We went to bed that night, not really expecting any problems, since we'd already been there for 6 days without any issues. Then suddenly I woke up to strange clicking sounds late at night. I got out of bed, thinking maybe it was one of my friends. I casually walked over to the noise, but I noticed all my friends were asleep, so I went to check where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the door, so I walked over, feeling really confused. I saw that the doors were slightly open, and the selfie stick was badly bent. I peeked outside and saw 3 people looking through the gap in the doors. They were right at the entrance, trying to push the doors open. I shouted at them, asking what they wanted. Then I noticed one of them had the wooden block in their hand. I was surprised and confused because I knew one of the men. He usually cleaned all the airbums and paths during the day, so it didn't make sense for him to be there at 3 a.m. The other guy asked if the wooden block was ours, claiming they found it outside our Airbnb. I knew something was fishy, because there was no good reason for them to be there at 3 a.m. I called out to my friends, and the 3 men quickly ran off. I explained the situation to my friends, and we stayed up all night, just in case they tried anything else. In the following morning, we decided to report the Airbnb reception about their employee, but the description I gave didn't match theirs. They told me their housekeeping staff were only women in their late 30s and 40s. We were scared when we realized we had let a total stranger into our rooms while we were away. But thankfully, nothing valuable was taken, and we got out of the situation safely. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, with the doors almost being opened. I want to share this story to warn people. It's not really scary, just strange, but at the time it really freaked me out. So I'm traveling around the country in my car. I've been driving for over a week from my hometown, and have been sleeping in my car to save money. It wasn't until I reached a big city that I decided to treat myself to a nice bed. So I chose Airbnb as it's cheaper than hotels. I booked it the day before I arrived in the city, and there weren't really many options left. I found an apartment on Airbnb that looked new and modern. It was in a great location, and the price was also very good. But the only downside was that it was a new listing with no reviews. So I thought the price was low because it was new and decided to try it. When I got to the apartment building, it looked older than I expected. Then I later realized that my room was probably the only renovated apartment in the building, which seemed to be in poor condition. It looked more like a dorm than an apartment building. Anyway, I let it go because I wasn't paying much, so I didn't expect a lot. The apartment itself looked like the pictures, so that was good enough. Everything went well for the first 2 days. As a woman traveling alone, I always make sure to stay safe. I don't go out after dark and always lock the door, using every lock, including the chain. On the 3rd day, I was out all morning and came back to the apartment to change before going to the beach. I locked the door again, including the chain. While I was in front of the door watching TV and changing, the door suddenly unlocked and someone opened it. I am very lucky that I had put the chain lock on the door, or it would have opened all the way. Anyway, my first reaction was to say, "Excuse me," and I quickly closed the door and locked it again. I didn't see who was trying to open it, because I came from the back of the door. I realized that this person could still get in, since they had the keys to the apartment. Then I thought maybe it was the owner coming back after I checked out, but I wasn't supposed to check out until the next day, so that wasn't possible. So I calmed down and called the owner. I explained what had happened. She said only she and I should have keys, and she was at work, so it couldn't have been her. Now I was scared to stay in the apartment, because someone could easily come in. But on other end, I didn't want to leave because all my valuables were there. It was a lose-lose situation for me. I called my dad, and he said it wasn't okay for someone else to have keys. He spoke to the owner, who promised to come with a locksmith to change the locks and give me new keys soon. She explained that she had owned the apartment for only 6 months, and that before my stay, there had been only one other Airbnb booking. Then she also said the apartment had been empty except for those 2 bookings, because she was renovating it. That explained why the building looked bad and didn't match the nice apartment. She suggested that the person with the keys might be the previous owners, or someone connected to them. How could it happen that I was gone all day every day, and the only time someone tried to come in was when I was home for just 10 minutes during the daytime? But what were they trying to do by coming in? Maybe this happened before, or maybe they saw me arrive and wanted to do something bad. These questions keep bothering me, but I feel incredibly lucky that I used the chain lock on the door, or I don't even want to think about what could have happened. I definitely won't be leaving a good review, and I won't stay in an Airbnb without reviews, or that seems too good to be true in the future. So before I tell the story, you should know a few little things. My bedroom is downstairs, and I live with my parents, 1 sister, and 1 housemaid. Now normally I always lock my door when I'm in my room, because it makes me feel safer, and the key is always in the lock on the inside of the door. I never take the key out of the lock, as I don't have a spare key. So I never lock the door from the outside. Then a few days ago, my housemaid saw me in the living room upstairs and asked if I could unlock my bedroom so she could clean. I laughed and told her it wasn't locked. She said she was sure it was locked, as she tried opening it several times, thinking it was stuck since she knew I was upstairs. She got scared and thought someone had come in, as my sister was upstairs with me and my parents weren't home. Besides, they would never go into my room and lock it. I went downstairs and opened the door right away. It wasn't locked or stuck. I've lived in this house for over 10 years, and my door works perfectly. I never had any problems with it, like it doesn't creak or get stuck. So I tried to see if the door was stuck, but it wasn't. I closed and opened it gently, roughly, and in every way possible, and it always opened normally. I brushed it off and told the housemaid it was probably just stuck that one time, but she insisted it wasn't stuck, and said it felt exactly like a locked door because she pushed really hard, and it wouldn't open. I didn't really believe her and didn't think much about it. The next day, my sister forgot her straightener in my room. She kept knocking and trying to open the door. So she called the housemaid, and they both tried pushing really hard, but it wouldn't open. When I got home, I saw them trying to open my door. I laughed and thought they were playing a prank on me. My sister was really angry and asked why I locked my bedroom. I told her I hadn't, and when I went to open it, it opened right away. They both looked at me like they had seen a ghost. I didn't believe them and thought they were definitely joking with me, even though they don't usually do things like that. Then yesterday, the same thing happened again. My dad called me and said he received an online order I made. He tried to put it in my room but found it locked, so he left it outside since I wasn't home. That's when I began to get really worried. I asked him if he thought the door was stuck, but he said it wasn't. It was clearly locked. The window has bars on the outside and is always locked, so no one could get in that way. It's impossible for someone to lock it from the outside because the key is always attached to my door from the inside, and there's no spare key. I'm really confused and scared. Is there some unknown entity stopping others from entering the room? On June 26th, my boyfriend and his best friend, along with his girlfriend, and I drove up to Big Bear. The next day, another friend joined us on June 27th, but he was supposed to sleep downstairs, while the couple slept upstairs, as there are only 2 bedrooms. It was kind of creepy because the cabin was very remote, and there were no lights outside. It was in the woods with coyotes howling and bears around, even though everything was normal. But on the night of the 27th, around 12 a.m., when my boyfriend and I were in bed, our friend who was sleeping downstairs started banging on the door, freaking out. He said he had been sleeping downstairs when he heard what sounded like someone walking outside. When he got up and looked out the small window, he saw a big man trying to open the front door. At first, I thought he was just joking and trying to scare us, but my boyfriend took it seriously. He got out of bed, glanced around the entire cabin, and even went outside. We went up to the other couple's room, which has a porch with a sliding glass door that looks out to the woods. Now it's important to note that I am naturally very anxious and scared, while my boyfriend is very calm and logical. I tend to imagine the worst, but he always stays calm. So when my boyfriend went over to look around the last place in the cabin and pulled the curtain, he suddenly jumped and yelled, "Oh my God." Now he is a CrossFit coach, and seeing a big guy like him scared makes me feel sick. He locked the door and backed away slowly. He quietly said, "There's a large man standing outside, staring at us. He's just standing in the woods, looking at us." Everyone was freaking out. I ran and locked the door behind us, and we all decided to stay in the room and keep watch. It was the middle of summer and very hot, but we refused to open a window. I was really scared but tried not to show it. About 30 minutes passed but nothing happened, so I got annoyed with the heat and the fact that there were 5 people crammed in a tiny room with 3 of them being men. So my boyfriend and I went back to our room, but I was still pretty scared, so my boyfriend tried to cheer me up. It was around 1:30 a.m. by then. I told him I was too scared to sleep with the lights off. He tells me it's okay, and he understands, so we just lay there with the lights on. Finally, I start drifting off to sleep when I hear a thud. I sit up and look at my boyfriend. He looks back at me, then the power cuts out. I immediately start crying. I try to get out of bed and run, but my legs get tangled in the sheets and I fall. My boyfriend picks me up and we grab our phones and run to the other room where everyone else was staying. I'm really upset at this point. I try to contact our host, but nothing works. I try to call my dad, but all our phones say no service. So we were completely isolated out there. But luckily, the friend who arrived later had a different phone carrier, and his phone had 1 bar of signal. He didn't waste any time and called the local sheriff. Now looking back, it might have been an overreaction, but at the time we were really scared. He talks to the sheriff, and they transfer us to the utilities company. We give them the address, and they tell us that we're too deep in the woods and they didn't cover that area. However, they said to calm down, and they would contact the fire department to reach us. When the fire department came and investigate the whole area, they found out someone had cut our cabin's power from outside. And not only that, but they also discovered that someone had tried to forcefully open our cabin's back door, but didn't succeed. We were fortunate that nothing bad happened to us. But even now, when I think about that night, I wonder what might have happened if our friend hadn't called the local sheriff's department. Things might have taken a disturbing turn. My name is Muhammad Lee. I am from New York City, and I'm Muslim. Back in 2015, I would always get bullied in middle school for being Muslim. People would call me terrorist and other names. But nobody came close to these two bullies of mine, whose names were Frankie and Johnny. They would go to an extreme other level. The things they did to me included pantsing me, beating me up, chasing me, shoving me into lockers and dunking my head into toilets, all because I was Muslim. I had some friends with me who weren't Islamophobic, but didn't really come to my defense when they saw me getting bullied. Now I will get to the point of this story. It was around the first weekend of December, and winter was approaching. My parents had nothing to do that weekend, so they wanted to go upstate to our country house, which is in the Catskill Mountains. I invited my friend Jaden to come with me, since he was and is still my best friend. We drove out of the city at around 6 o'clock on Friday night, and got to the house at around 8:30 to 9. When we got there, we all unpacked, took our shoes off, got dressed into night clothes, brushed our teeth, and we all went to bed. My parents stayed in their bedroom, while Jaden stayed in the same bedroom I was in. The next morning, we ate breakfast, and after that, me and Jaden wanted to go geocaching, since we lived right next to a state forest that had plenty of hiking trails. Me and Jaden loved geocaching, and we have been doing it ever since first grade. My parents told us that we were allowed to do it, but we were only allowed to do it for a maximum of 4 hours. So we set off. An hour and a half passed by, and we already found like 4 or 5 treasures on our hike. We wrote our names down on a sheet with a pen to say that we were here, traded valuable objects, and placed them back in the hiding spots. We were now at a waterfall. The site was very pretty, and the next cache was 0.4 miles away. As we were walking, talking, and trying to locate the next geocache, we heard a best sound from behind us. We turned around, and we saw something even more scarier than the scariest horror movie ever. There were 2 people, and take a guess who it was. Frankie and Johnny, my 2 biggest bullies in school. How in God's name were they in the same place that we were in? Did they secretly have a house up here? Did they follow us? How is this even possible? They couldn't have gotten here by themselves since they were the same age as I was, and we all were in middle school. My mind was still processing all of it. I said to both of them, "What the heck are you 2 doing here? How did you guys even find us?" Frankie then spoke and said, "You thought you could escape us, but no, you're wrong." I remember very descriptively that he said this. My eyes gazed in front of me, and I saw a large knife in Frankie's hand. That really frightened me. All of a sudden Johnny sprinted and walked towards me, and before I could even run, he grabbed my entire body from around the back. It was impossible to escape him, as he held me with a monster grip. He was taking me somewhere. We were going right to the edge of where the fall was. There were no bars to prevent us from falling into the deep water below us. It was all open. I was now scared for my life. Did he actually plan on killing me? I didn't want to know. I heard Jaden wailing for help. I turned around only to see Frankie holding him with a knife to his neck. Both of our lives were now in danger. I was now at the edge of where the fall was. As I was still trying to break free from Johnny, he started to speak. I very clearly remember him saying to me, "This is what you're going to get. You terrorists killed my great-uncle when 9/11 happened." His tone was now more angry than ever. I pleaded with him not to kill me, and I said that me and my parents were born in America and that we weren't like them. He didn't listen to me. Instead, he kept holding on to me, still filled with rage inside of him. I started to cry and kept yelling like a little girl to let me go, and he still wouldn't listen. You know, in a movie scene when a protagonist is saved from the antagonist, well, that's what happened. Right from behind me I heard gunshots. We all turned around, and Johnny let go of me as I fell to the ground with my knees touching it. We all saw a hunter running towards us with a rifle in his hand. He kept shouting, "Let them go," over and over. He was now feet away from us. He shouted again, and this time he said, "Get the hell out of here, you 2. Scram." This was directed at Frankie and Johnny. They both ran and disappeared out of sight. He then walked slowly at us and asked us if we were all right. We said we were okay, and we thanked him for saving us. He then asked us who those 2 punks were. We told him the truth and said they were school bullies of mine, and they somehow managed to follow us from the city to upstate. The man was in such disbelief hearing this. He then offered us a ride home, and we accepted his offer. We got home in 10 to 15 minutes, and they allowed the man to come inside the house as he was our witness. We walked through the door and my mother asked, "Who is this?" My parents were pretty confused at that moment, and I don't blame them. I said that this guy saved us from the 2 bullies who regularly harassed me at school. They didn't seem to believe what I said at first, as they looked very suspicious, but we told my parents the story. After telling them the story, their moods had now shifted to beyond horrified. They were in shock hearing all of this, and they told me, Jaden, and the man to all go to the police station to report this, and I couldn't have agreed more. We got to the station. Jaden and the hunter all told the investigator the events that went down as my parents were waiting in the lobby. They thanked us and told us that they would try to get in contact with our school board back in the city. Hearing them say this put me in a much better mood. That night and the next day was just pretty chill. We didn't do anything, and we went back to the city Sunday, late afternoon. I was still a little shaken up by the incident, but I was able to calm down. The next day then came, and it was Monday. I was called into the principal's office, and I was told that Frankie and Johnny had both been expelled after what they did to me and Jaden. I was so happy to hear this, as both of those two assholes would not have to bother me anymore. The rest of my school years went pretty smoothly. Every once in a while I would get called names like terrorists, but it never came to physical bullying again, and I didn't take it too personally because we were all still ignorant young kids. I never saw or heard from Johnny again. I saw Frankie one last time in 2019 on a street. I was walking on a sidewalk, and he was walking the other way on the same sidewalk. He didn't even look at me, as if he was too scared to. As of today, nobody has made fun of me for being a Muslim, as New York City has become more liberal. I eventually got over this incident, but whenever I see someone online or in person saying bad things about Muslims, the memory of what happened almost a decade ago plays back in my head and serves as a reminder that there will always be screwed up people in this world. I was 21 back in 2019, and I worked during the day at a place called Coconut's Car Wash in Flagler County, Florida. I didn't go to college because I couldn't afford it. My boss wasn't exactly the friendliest person, but he paid me a respectable amount of money, and I got along with almost everyone at work, except one guy who made me quit my job that year because of his creepy advancements towards me. This guy's name was Nicholas Sess, and he was 25 years old. He started working at the car wash at the beginning of that year. At first, he seemed like he was a safe person to talk to. He acted polite, and he made eye contact with me when we had conversations. We exchanged each other's social media, and it was normal at first. In March, he started acting more creepy towards me. He would keep touching me every chance that he could get. He would say he was doing it accidentally, but I wasn't dense, and I knew a liar when I would see one. He would also keep messaging me on Instagram for me to go out with him. I kept telling him that I wasn't interested, but he didn't take the hint. I was now feeling unsafe at work. I couldn't stand being in the same area as that creeper. I tried to talk with the manager about this, but he was so rude, and he said to me that I have to deal with my own problems. I had no one to talk to. My parents weren't that loving to me, and I didn't have enough money to go and talk about this with a therapist. My other coworkers claimed that they were too busy to talk to. I was alone. Nick's behavior started to get even worse. He went on social media harassing me with disgusting love notes. One night, this finally reached a boiling point. I was just coming out of the shower with my bathrobe on, and the shades to my window were left open. I caught a quick glance outside for a brief second, turned away for half a second, and then turned my head in that same direction again. What I saw was pure terror. The outside streetlights provided a clear view, only to see my creepy coworker, Nick, outside of my house, sitting on what I assumed to be his bike. Right as he saw me, he pedaled off away from my house until I couldn't see him anymore. How did he even know where I lived? I never told him my home address, and I never hung out with him outside of work. That was it. I went to my phone and blocked him on everything. After that, I emailed my boss and told him that I was quitting because of Nick's advancements. I complained to my boss on many different occasions, but he did nothing, and the only way to end this was if I left. After I finished that, I went to bed and I hoped that it would be the end of it. But the truth is, it wasn't, and it kept getting worse from here. The next morning, I woke up and I saw a bunch of Instagram DM messages from an account that I did not recognize. I opened that app, and it was obviously Nick. He actually made another account because I blocked him. The messages looked really torrent, odd, and did not make any sense. This made me very uncomfortable in nature. He also did the same for Snapchat. I blocked him on both apps again. Now this was before you could block someone on Instagram and new accounts that they created or have. The whole next 2 days, he would keep making more accounts, and I was still blocking them. In all honesty, I was not surprised. Nick had become such a nuisance that I decided that I would disable my social media accounts because he was borderline stalking me. That night I heard a knock at my front door. It had to have been Nick. I walked over to the door and looked through the peephole, and this confirmed that it was in fact him. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make it aware that I was home despite all the lights being on, and my car was parked in the driveway. He kept knocking, and he finally said something. He said that he would not leave, and if I didn't open the door and give him an explanation, we would have a problem. Right there and then, I gathered the courage to say to him through the closed door that my father had owned a gun. I then got my phone out and called 911. I connected to an operator and told every detail over the phone. I stayed on the line until the police got there. A police car pulled up right in front of my house, and I saw 3 officers step out of the car. They came in, and I told them everything that transpired. After this, they left, and they were able to locate where Nick lived. They didn't arrest him, but they warned him to leave me alone. I thought this would do something, but of course Nick didn't listen. In fact, the next morning the police caught him biking on his way to my house. This time they arrested him, and he was taken to the police station. He was put in an interrogation room, where he admitted some very disturbing things. He confessed that he had been outside of my house multiple times for the past 2 months, and collected photos that I'd posted online. This made me feel like my world was crumbling into pieces. Why would he still think that I would date him after I told him no many times? Nick is currently facing a felony charge of burglary of a dwelling and a misdemeanor stalking charge. He is looking to face up to 15 years in prison and $11,000 in fines. When he gets released from prison, I highly doubt that he will still be obsessed with me and will be able to put it past him. I just hope that I am right about that. It was a bright sunny afternoon, the kind where the world feels too normal for anything strange to happen. I was with my 2 friends, Jamie and Linda, standing at the edge of the old abandoned St. Luke's Hospital. It had been shut down for decades, a crumbling building with shattered windows and peeling paint, yet the town was still full of rumors about it. Some said the place was haunted by the spirits of children who never left, while others swore they'd seen lights flickering inside, even during the day. None of us really believed it, but the stories had a way of getting under our skin. Jamie, always the daring one, dared us to go inside. "It's broad daylight," he said with a grin. "What's the worst that could happen?" Linda hesitated, but I could tell she didn't want to look scared in front of him. Me? I didn't want to admit how uneasy the place made me, so I shrugged and said, "All right, let's do it." We pushed open the heavy front doors, their hinges groaning like something alive. Inside, the air was stale and cold, a sharp contrast to the sunny day outside. Dust motes floated in the dim light streaming through the broken windows. The tiled floor was cracked, and every step we took echoed eerily through the empty halls. Despite the daylight, shadows seemed to gather in the corners, too dark and too still. We wandered through the hospital, joking and laughing nervously to mask our discomfort. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it crude drawings and swear words, but some of it was unsettling, scrawled messages like, "They're still here, and don't look back." Linda pointed at one that said, "We hear them play," and laughed uneasily. "Kids must have been bored," she muttered. We found ourselves in what must have once been the pediatric wing. The small rooms had rusted beds and faded murals of smiling animals on the walls. It felt wrong, like we shouldn't be there, but none of us said anything. Jamie picked up a stuffed bear from the floor, its fur matted and its eyes missing, and made a joke about it being haunted. I forced a laugh, but my skin prickled. That's when we heard it, a faint sound coming from down the hall. It was high-pitched and cheerful, like children laughing. At first I thought I imagined it, but then Linda turned to me, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she said. Jamie shrugged, trying to look unimpressed. "It's probably the wind or something." But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, as if whoever or whatever was laughing was getting closer. The laughter was strange too, like it didn't belong here. It was too light, too happy, too alive for a place like this. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was just an echo, maybe from kids outside. Then we heard something else, a soft creak, like a wheel turning. We all turned toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. A medical trolley was moving down the hallway. It rolled slowly, its wheels squeaking, and then stopped just a few feet from us. None of us had touched it. The hallway was completely still, no breeze, no one else around. But the trolley moved on its own. It stopped right in front of the door we had entered, blocking the way out. I froze, my brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven, maybe it was some kind of prank, but I knew none of that made sense. Jamie walked toward it, trying to act brave. "All right, who's messing with us?" he called out, his voice shaking slightly. He grabbed the trolley and tried to push it aside, but it didn't budge. It was like it had fused with the floor. Jamie stepped back, his confidence fading. The laughter started again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. It sounded like it was coming from the rooms around us. Small, light footsteps padded down the hall, though we couldn't see anyone. "Let's go," Linda said, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny anymore." We turned to leave, but the trolley still blocked the door. Jamie shoved it again, grunting with effort, but it wouldn't move. Then we heard the voices. "Come play with us," a child's voice called, sweet and sing-song. It echoed through the hall, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Another voice joined in, this one quieter, almost whispering, "We've been waiting for you." My heart hammered in my chest. I looked at Linda and Jamie, and I could see the terror on their faces. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some trick of the wind or an old building settling. Something was here. The laughter turned into giggles, then whispers, then crying. It was everywhere, surrounding us. The sound filled my head, growing louder and louder, until I couldn't think. Jamie grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "We have to find another way out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We ran, not caring where we were going, just desperate to get away from the voices. The hospital seemed to twist and change around us. Hallways stretched longer than they should have, and doors that had been opened were suddenly locked. The air grew colder, and the light streaming through the windows dimmed, as if the sun itself had abandoned us. We found a stairwell and bolted down it, our footsteps echoing like gunshots. At the bottom, we found a side door, its rusted lock hanging loose. Jamie yanked it open, and we stumbled out into the blinding daylight. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, breathing hard, staring back at the hospital. It looked the same as before, silent, still, crumbling in the afternoon sun. But I knew we hadn't imagined it. I could still hear the voices, faint and distant, as if they were watching us from the windows. We didn't talk about what happened as we walked back to town. No jokes, no dares, nothing. It was like the place had taken something from us, our confidence, our curiosity, maybe even a part of our sanity. This happened a long time ago, back in 1989. I hope I can tell the story in a way that conveys just how bad this scared me. I still don't know what it really was or what happened, so I make no claims about the explanation. I still think about this sometimes. I was 19 years old and working in an after-school care that was running out of the building of a small church in the rural southern town where I lived. The church was small and shaped like an L, with a door at the top of the L, the sanctuary at the elbow of the L, and a door at the short end of the L. There was also a full basement that was furnished and used for the Sunday school rooms, where the kids from the after-school program did homework and played games sometimes. There were only about 12 or 13 kids in the program, most of the time, and I think one time we swelled to something like a whopping 17. Because the church was small and the community was small, there were no aspirations to have a large program, and the entire thing was really to provide appearance in the church. Anyway, what I would do every weekday was attend community college classes in the morning, and then go straight from classes to the church, and work on homework or read until the kids were dropped off by the school bus. I usually had between 2 to 2.5 hours either completely alone in the church, or sometimes the pastor would stop by and work in his office, but mostly I was alone. I never heard or saw anything at all, and I was locked inside the building so no one could come in. Even when the kids were there, the doors stayed locked for safety. I did this for a full year and a summer, and then the second year my best friend at the time came to work with me. She and I were both pretty serious kids in the sense that we didn't drink or do drugs. We weren't into anything occult or spooky, just normal young girls who went to college classes and went to work. One day not too long after she started working with me, I had the kids in the basement playing games while some of them worked on homework. The deal was that one of us would prepare snacks in the kitchen upstairs while the other one entertained the kids. She was upstairs making a snack when all of a sudden I heard the door at the top of the basement stairs open, and she came running down the stairs calling my name. I could hear the fear in her voice, so I met her at the bottom of the stairs, and she was scared. She was not one to be dramatic at all, and I had never seen her scared before, and I'd known her since the 8th grade. I asked her what was wrong, and she said in a trembling voice that she'd heard someone in the sanctuary. I said, "What? No way, we're here by ourselves. It must be your imagination." But she was adamant that she'd heard someone upstairs in the sanctuary, and she was scared to death. Again I told her she must be mistaken, and she said, "I'm not kidding. There's somebody up there moving around in the sanctuary, and I saw something. I don't know what it was." The sanctuary in the elbow of the L shape of the church was right beside the kitchen, where she'd been preparing snacks. I was a brave kid, and had more bravery than brains at the time. I told her to stay in the basement with the kids, and that I was going up to check it out. That scared her as well, and she told me not to go. It was a stupid thing for me to do, considering that if someone had been in up there I could have been attacked, and I really wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. But anyway, I went up to the top of the stairs, stuck my head out the door, and first made sure no one was in the hallway. Next I checked all of the Sunday school rooms down the long arm of the L along with the pastor's office. I found nothing, so by this time I was sure she'd heard the wind. It was fall and windy, or heard the foundation of the building settle, and it spooked her. Next I checked the bathrooms at the short end of the L and made sure that all of the doors to the building were locked. No one had come into the building since we got there, and the doors had been locked when I arrived that day, so I was absolutely sure we were alone. Next I walked up to the door of the sanctuary and looked through the small window at the top of the door and saw nothing. There was a row of pews on each side of the sanctuary, a pulpit up front, and on the left side of the pulpit was a closed door that led to the choir area. So I opened one of the doors and walked into the sanctuary and slowly made my way up to about halfway of the pews, and I stopped and looked around. Everything was dead silent. I said, "Hello, is there anybody here?" "Hello." And just as I finished saying that, the door to the left-hand side of the pulpit slowly swung, all the way open. I can't really put into words the feeling that hit my body. The blood drained down out of my torso and into my legs, which both tried to run and were bolted to the floor at the same time. A jolt of adrenaline surged through my body, and at the same time, I felt like I was moving in slow motion as I turned and bolted out of the sanctuary and down the stairs, yelling to get the kids out of the building. We got the kids out back and debated what to do. This was the time before cell phones, so one of us still had to go back inside and call the pastor to come down, or we all had to stand outside and wait for a parent or someone from the church to come by and check things out, which could be a very long time. I went back inside to the pastor's office and quickly used the phone to call his house and ask for someone to come by. When the church was searched, nothing was found, and everyone thought we had overactive imaginations. Like I said in the beginning, I make no claims as to what opened that door or what my friend heard, but something or someone was in that church with us that day, and I never felt comfortable alone there again.